Hey everyone, tonight we are digging deep, quite literally, into the cold, damp earth of history. Imagine yourself lowered into a pit, the air thick with the smell of wet soil and something else, something ancient and undisturbed. The silence is absolute, broken only by the drip of water that has been seeping through the ground for millennia. You're in a place that was sealed off from the world centuries before the Roman Empire even reached its peak. And frankly, you probably wouldn't survive this for long without modern equipment. The air is low in oxygen, the walls are perpetually threatening to collapse, and that ancient water is teeming with bacteria that have never met an antibiotic. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. As always, I'd love to see where you're all listening from, so drop your city and local time in the comments below. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Your journey begins not in some grand sweeping desert landscape, but in the damp, fertile plains of Hubei province, China. The year is 1965. The world is a very different place. The Cold War is a chilling reality, the space race is in full swing, and here in the Jiangling County, a team of engineers is working on a decidedly more terrestrial project, the expansion of the Jianghe Reservoir. Their goal is practical, to control water for irrigation. But in doing so, they are about to accidentally knock on the door of a lost kingdom. Before the area is flooded, a team of archaeologists is sent to conduct a survey. It's a standard procedure, a race against the clock to document any cultural relics before they are lost forever beneath the rising waters. You are with that team. The air is cool, heavy with the moisture from the nearby Yangtze River. This isn't a glamorous dig. There are no pyramids, no golden death masks peeking from the sand. There are just dozens of earthen mounds, unassuming hillocks that a casual observer might mistake for natural features of the landscape. You and the team focus on a cluster of these mounds known as wangshan. The work is methodical, almost tedious. You scrape away layers of earth, documenting every pottery shard, every discolored patch of soil. These tombs, you soon discover, belong to the state of Chu, a powerful kingdom that flourished during China's spring and autumn period. This is a pivotal era in history, stretching from roughly 771 to 476 BCE. It was a time of immense turmoil and fragmentation, where the old Zhou dynasty had lost its grip and 100 smaller states vied for supremacy. Yet it was also a period of incredible intellectual ferment, the very era that produced foundational thinkers like Confucius and Laozi. Each tomb you open tells a small story of this violent, vibrant time. You move to tomb number 1. It's not the largest of the mounds, but it's the one that calls to you today. As you dig deeper, the ground becomes saturated. Soon, you're not just digging through soil, but through a thick, cold mud. The entire burial chamber is flooded. This is, for an archaeologist, usually a moment of profound disappointment. Water is the great destroyer. It accelerates the decay of wood, silk, and lacquer. It leaches into the very structure of bronze, turning mighty weapons and intricate vessels into fragile, green, crusted ghosts. The expectation now is to find little more than some resilient jade and perhaps the ghostly outline of a coffin. Yet as the water is pumped away, something remarkable is revealed. The tomb is an anaerobic environment. The water and dense clay have pushed out the oxygen, creating a kind of natural time capsule. Inside, you find the remains of a massive 2-layered wooden coffin. Preserving it is a nightmare, but the contents are the real prize. Alongside the skeleton of what must have been a Chu nobleman, you find over 50 other tombs filled with an array of stunning artifacts. There are bronze ritual vessels still holding the potential for some, let's call it aggressively vintage soup. One of the more peculiar and frankly endearing finds in tombs from this period can be bells. Not just one bell, but entire sets of precisely tuned bronze bells. Sometimes dozens of them, which would have been used to play complex ceremonial music for the deceased in the afterlife. It's a beautiful thought, sending someone off with a full orchestra. Amidst these treasures, nestled right beside the skeleton's left side, is an object. It's long and slender, encased in a wooden scabbard coated in black lacquer. It is, without a doubt, a sword. But it shouldn't look like this. The lacquer is almost perfect. its dark sheen absorbing the light from your lamps. There's a quiet tension in the air. Everyone knows the rule. Bronze plus 2.5 millennia of water equals a crumbling, corroded mess. It's a fundamental law of archaeology, as reliable as gravity. The question of how this tomb came to be so perfectly sealed is a source of considerable academic back and forth. Historians still argue whether the extensive waterlogging of these southern Chu tombs was an intentional preservation technique, a sophisticated form of ancient burial science, or simply a geographical accident born of a high water table. You watch as two of the senior archaeologists carefully, gently, lift the sword from its resting place. It feels solid. It has a weight to it that speaks of integrity, not decay. They hold it for a moment, the silence in the tomb now thick with anticipation. Millennia of water and earth have guarded this object. For 2,500 years, it has waited in the dark, untouched by the world of the living. Everyone leans in a little closer, breaths held. The lead archaeologist gives a slight nod. With infinite care, one hand grips the hilt, the other the scabbard. It's time to see what secret this waterlogged grave has been keeping. The seconds stretch into an eternity. Your eyes are fixed on the hands of the archaeologist holding the scabbard. Every sound in the tomb seems amplified. The distant hum of the water pump, the soft squelch of a boot shifting in the mud, the almost imperceptible whisper of breath from the person beside you. The lead archaeologist's knuckles are white as he grips the hilt. The scabbard is made of wood, coated in that impossibly preserved black lacquer. The hilt is simple, almost plain, its silk wrapping long since rotted away but leaving behind a faint crisscross impression, a ghost of the grip that a noble warrior once held. With a slow, deliberate motion, he begins to draw the blade. It doesn't move at first. There's a moment of collective dread. Perhaps it's fused inside a solid mass of corrosion. Perhaps this beautiful exterior hides a decayed and worthless core. Then, with a faint sigh, it gives. Not the grating screech of rusted metal, but the smooth, whisper-quiet slide of a perfect fit. The first inch of the blade emerges into the lamplight, and everyone stops breathing. It can't be. Your mind simply refuses to process what your eyes are seeing. The metal isn't the dull greenish-brown of ancient, patinated bronze. It's alive. It shines with a soft, golden bronze luster, as if it were cast only yesterday. As more of the blade is revealed, the gleam travels down its length, a ripple of impossible light in the subterranean gloom. It catches the weak yellow glow of the lamps and throws it back with a cool metallic indifference. There are no pits. There is no corrosion. There is only the flawless, unblemished surface of a weapon that has spent 2.5 millennia submerged in water. It is, in a word, perfect. When the entire 55.7 centimeter length of the blade is free of the scabbard, the archaeologist holds it aloft. It is a jian, the quintessential Chinese double-edged straight sword. This weapon type was known in ancient China as the gentleman of weapons, a sidearm favored by nobles, scholars, and high-ranking officials. Unlike the heavier, single-edged dao, which was more of a brutish cavalry weapon, the jian was a symbol of personal refinement and authority. To carry a jian of this quality was to announce your status to the world, a clear sign that you were a person of significant power and taste. Holding this one now, it feels less like an archaeological find and more like an object pulled from a legend. The hilt guard is inlaid with blue turquoise, and the pommel at the very end of the hilt is a masterpiece of concentric circles, a design that speaks of sophisticated artistry. But your eyes are drawn back to the blade itself. The surface isn't uniform. It's covered in an intricate and beautiful pattern of repeating dark gray, rhombic shapes set against the lighter bronze of the blade's body. The pattern is so precise, so regular, it looks like it was etched by a machine. It flows over the surface, a geometric river of dark and light metal that seems to shift as the light plays across it. This isn't just a weapon, it's a work of art of the highest order. The initial stunned silence from the team finally breaks, erupting into a flurry of hushed, incredulous questions in Mandarin. How is this possible? Is it a fake? A joke? But the context makes that impossible. It was sealed in a tomb that has been verifiably undisturbed for thousands of years. This is no replica. This is the real, terrifying, beautiful thing. One of the younger assistants, trying to lighten the mood, probably mutters something about time travelers leaving their stuff behind, but the joke hangs in the air, feeling strangely plausible for a split second. An ancient Chu warrior seeing this blade drawn wouldn't have just seen a sharp piece of metal. They would have seen a vessel brimming with ki, or life force. To them, a sword forged with such mastery was not an inanimate object but a powerful entity in its own right, possessing a spirit and a will. Ancient Chinese texts are filled with stories of legendary swords that could leap from their scabbards to defend their owners, or that would hum with a low energy, thirsting for battle. Looking at the impossible gleam of this blade in the dim light, you can almost understand why they believe that. It feels awake. The discovery immediately presents a profound puzzle, not just of metallurgy, but of context. This tomb belonged to a nobleman of the Chu state. The style of the tomb, the artifacts within it, all point to Chu. Yet, as you'll soon find out, the sword belongs to a king from an enemy state. This leads to a fascinating question, and archaeologists and historians still debate the precise ritual significance of placing a ruler's personal weapon in the tomb of a lesser nobleman. Was it a trophy of war, claimed in battle and buried with a victorious general? Or was it a diplomatic gift, a symbol of a temporary alliance or a marriage contract between two rival powers? The sword's presence here is a paradox, a clue to a political drama whose script has been lost to time. For now, the team's focus shifts from discovery to preservation. This artifact is priceless, a single object that has just rewritten the entire textbook on ancient Chinese metallurgy. It must be protected, slowly, reverently. The sword is laid upon a piece of velvet-lined board, its impossible gleam a silent testament to the lost genius of its creators. The darkness of the tomb gave up a secret, and now the light of the modern world must find a way to understand it. You follow the sword as it leaves the dark, damp embrace of the tomb and enters the stark, fluorescent lit world of a modern laboratory. The journey is a jarring transition across 25 centuries. One moment, it's an object of quiet reverence in its earthen grave. The next, it's laid out on a sterile steel table surrounded by people in white coats. The initial, almost mystical awe you felt in the tomb begins to give way to a more analytical curiosity. The team is abuzz, their hushed whispers replaced by the excited chatter of scientific inquiry. They are documenting every minute detail, its exact weight, its balance point, the precise chemical composition of the turquoise on its hilt. It's during this meticulous examination that the first unplanned test occurs. An archaeologist, let's call him Chen, is leaning in close, using a magnifying glass to inspect the intricate patterns on the blade. He adjusts his position, and for a fraction of a second, the back of his hand brushes against the edge of the sword. There's no sound. He feels no pain. But when he pulls his hand away, a thin, perfectly straight line of crimson appears on his skin. A single bead of blood wells up. Everyone freezes. Chen stares at his hand, not in pain, but in sheer, dumbfounded amazement. It is the kind of cut you get from a surgeon's scalpel or a freshly honed razor blade, so clean the nerve endings barely register the separation. The room goes silent as the implication sinks in. This isn't just a well-preserved artifact. This is a well-preserved, lethally functional weapon. It's one thing to see the gleam, but it's another thing entirely to be touched by its enduring sharpness. This accidental confirmation creates a new imperative. They have to know just how sharp it is. This isn't about morbid curiosity. It's about scientific documentation. To understand the technology, they must first understand its capabilities. A senior member of the team makes a decision. A stack of paper is brought in. Not flimsy notebook paper, but thick, high-quality stock. Someone methodically counts out 20 sheets and places the stack on a table. It seems like a ridiculous test. You've seen modern, factory-made knives struggle with a task like this. To ask it of a bronze sword that, as older than the Great Wall of China, feels like setting it up for failure. Bronze is, by its nature, a softer metal than steel. It's prone to dulling. A bronze edge that has spent millennia underwater should have the cutting power of a butter knife. Two researchers, wearing thick protective gloves, carefully lift the sword. They hold it vertically over the stack of paper. There's no dramatic, sweeping motion, no martial arts flourish. This is a scientific experiment. They slowly lower the blade, allowing its own weight to press down on the paper. The tip touches the top sheet, and with a sound like rustling silk, it sinks in. It continues its descent, parting the layers of paper with an eerie, frictionless ease. It doesn't tear or snag. It just separates. In a few seconds, it has passed cleanly through all 20 sheets, resting its tip on the table below. The researchers lift the sword away. The two halves of the paper stack fall away from each other, revealing a cut so clean, so perfect, you could slice a tomato on it. This result is, scientifically speaking, ludicrous. It defies the known properties of the material. The mastery of bronze casting during China's Zhou dynasty, which encompasses the spring and autumn period, was already known to be incredibly advanced. They were pioneers in creating complex alloys, often using a higher percentage of tin in the bronze for the cutting edges of weapons to make them harder and more brittle, while using a lower tin, more flexible bronze for the spine. This bi-metallic construction made their swords less likely to shatter in combat. But what you're seeing here goes beyond even that. This is a level of edge retention that shouldn't be possible. Of course, the idea of test cutting is nothing new. While we might associate the art of tameshigiri with the samurai of Japan, the practice of testing a blade's quality is ancient and universal. And let's be thankful for the paper test, because the historical alternatives were significantly more grim. Ancient texts from various cultures describe new blades being tested on everything from thick bamboo stalks to, in the more brutal accounts, condemned criminals. The clean, quiet slice through paper serves as a far more civilized, yet equally chilling, demonstration of this sword's deadly purpose. The perfection of the blade and its edge inevitably fuels a long-standing academic conversation. Scholars still argue whether a sword of this unparalleled quality was ever intended for the grit and chaos of actual battle, or if it was a purely ceremonial dress sword. On one hand, its flawless condition suggests it was a treasure, too precious to risk on the battlefield where it could be nicked by a clumsy parry or stained by the grime of combat. On the other hand, its terrifying sharpness proves it was anything but a mere ornament. It was a functional weapon of the highest possible caliber. Was it a king's last line of defense? A symbol of his power made real? Or was it a badge of office, meant to be drawn only in the most formal of court settings? Perhaps the answer is both. For now, the sword rests on the laboratory table, a silent challenge to everyone in the room. The awe of its discovery has been replaced by the stark, undeniable evidence of its function. The gleam was a promise. The cut was the proof. This single artifact has opened a Pandora's box of questions that will consume metallurgists, chemists, and historians for decades to come. How was its alloy composed? How was it forged? And what miraculous process protected it not only from the ravages of time but from the very laws of chemistry itself? The mystery has deepened, and the quest for answers has only just begun. The perfectly sliced stack of paper lies on the table, a testament to an edge that defies time. But as astonishing as the sword's physical properties are, an even deeper mystery is literally written on its surface. Your attention is now drawn away from the lethal edges and toward the base of the blade, just below the hilt guard. There, etched into the bronze with meticulous care, are 2 columns of characters. But you don't need to be an expert in ancient languages to see that this isn't the kind of script you find in a modern Chinese newspaper. The characters are intricate, flowing, and almost alive. Strokes are elongated into the graceful necks of birds, or twisted into the segmented bodies of worms. This is a highly stylized and rare form of writing known as birdworm seal script, an artistic calligraphy used almost exclusively on high-status bronze artifacts from the southern states during this period. It's beautiful, esoteric, and notoriously difficult to decipher. It's a message locked in a 2,500-year-old cipher. For weeks, the best epigraphers in China study rubbings of the inscription. They compare the elaborate characters to other, more fragmented examples found on bronze bells and vessels. Slowly, painstakingly, they begin to unlock the secret. The 8 characters, arranged in 2 columns of 4, are a declaration of ownership and identity. They read, Yue Wang Goujian zizuo Yongjian, Yue Wang Goujian zizuo Yongjian. The translation sends a shockwave through the historical community. King Goujian of Yue, made this sword for his own personal use. The sword now has a name, and not just any name. It belongs to a legend. The focus of the story pivots from a mysterious object to the enigmatic, ruthless, and brilliant man who once held it. So, who was Goujian? To understand the sword, you have to understand the man. King Goujian, who reigned from 496 to 465 BCE, was not some minor provincial lord. He was one of the last and most famous of the 5 hegemons of the spring and autumn period. This was a title reserved for a handful of rulers who, through a combination of military might, political cunning, and sheer force of will, managed to dominate the chaotic landscape of ancient China. Think of it as being the chairman of the board of a very, very violent corporation. Goujian's story is the stuff of epic poetry, a dramatic saga of defeat, humiliation, and one of the most patient and meticulously planned acts of revenge in all of history. He was a man who, by all accounts, was forged in the same fires of adversity as his incredible sword. His kingdom Yue was located along the southeastern coast of China, in the region of modern Zhejiang province. To the established civilized states of the Central Plains, Yue was the frontier. It was seen as a semi-barbaric land, its people culturally distinct. The Yue people were known for their maritime skills, their unique customs like full-body tattooing, and for wearing their hair short, a practice considered shockingly uncivilized by the northern nobles who meticulously kept their hair long and pinned up in a topknot. It is a bit like the ancient equivalent of showing up to a formal gala with a punk rock haircut and a facial tattoo. You might be powerful, but you're not playing by the established rules. This outsider status likely contributed to the fierce independence and ambition of its rulers, most notably Goujian himself. In a world defined by constant, near-total warfare, a king's survival, and that of his state, depended on having the best of everything: the most loyal generals, the most impenetrable forts, and the deadliest weapons. This is the context that gives birth to a sword like Goujian's. It wasn't an indulgence, it was a necessity. A king's personal weapon was the ultimate symbol of his power, an extension of his own will. Commissioning a blade of this quality sent a message to rivals and allies alike. I am a ruler of substance, taste, and lethal capability. Goujian would have lived in a world steeped in superstition and ritual. Before embarking on any major undertaking, from a military campaign to the forging of a new sword, a ruler would have consulted with diviners. These mystics would practice pyromancy, often on the shell of a turtle or the shoulder blade of an ox. They would apply a hot poker to the bone until it cracked, and then read the patterns of the fissures to glimpse the will of the heavens. A flawless sword, emerging perfect from its cast, would have been seen as a powerful omen, a clear sign that the king's actions were blessed by the gods. The beginning of Goujian's epic story, however, is marked by a disastrous failure. His reign began with a crushing defeat at the hands of his arch-rival, King Fuchai of the neighboring state of Wu. This initial conflict is a flashpoint of historical contention. Historians still argue whether Goujian's initial devastating defeat was the result of his own youthful arrogance or the masterful espionage of Wu's top ministers. Was he a reckless young king who underestimated his enemy? Or was he the victim of a brilliant intelligence operation that left his armies walking into a perfectly laid trap? The ancient sources are ambiguous, written by victors and colored by legend. What we do know is that this defeat set the stage for everything that followed. It's what transforms Goujian from just another king into a figure of legend. And now, as you look at the sword on the table, it's no longer just an anonymous masterpiece. It is the Sword of Goujian. Its impossible resilience, its enduring sharpness, its cold, beautiful perfection. All of these qualities now seem to reflect the very character of the man who commissioned it. The blade is no longer just a piece of metal. It's a biography written in bronze, a direct physical link to a king whose thirst for vengeance would become one of the defining stories of his age. You're standing in the lab, the name Goujian of Yue echoing in your mind. But a king is defined by his enemies as much as by his kingdom. This sword, a pinnacle of artistic and military achievement, wasn't created for parades or palace decoration. It was forged in the crucible of one of the most bitter and personal rivalries of the ancient world, the long bloody war between the state of Yue and its northern neighbor, the state of Wu. To understand the sword, you have to understand this feud. It was a grudge match that spanned generations, fueled by ambition, geography, and a relentless cycle of revenge. Picture the map of ancient China during the spring and autumn period. While the civilized states bickered over the fertile lands of the Central Plains, Wu and Yue occupied the swampy, river-laced frontier of the Yangtze River Delta. They were neighbors in the worst possible way, close enough to be perennial rivals, culturally similar enough to know exactly how to provoke each other, and both ambitious enough to believe there was only room for one major power in the south. Their shared landscape of lakes, rivers, and marshes meant that warfare here was different. This wasn't the domain of the grand chariot armies that dominated the northern states. This was a land of infantry ambushes in dense reeds and, most importantly, of naval power. The fates of Wu and Yue would be decided on the water. The blood feud that would come to define Goujian's life began not with him, but with his father. King Yunchang of Yue saw an opportunity when the formidable King Helu of Wu was away on a campaign against another state, Chu. Yunchang launched an attack on a vulnerable Wu, a move that was strategically sound but which lit a fire of hatred that would burn for decades. In 496 BCE, King Helu, infuriated by the attack on his homeland, turned his armies south to punish Yue. By this time, Yunchang had died and the throne had passed to his young son Goujian. This invasion would be his first great test as a ruler. The two armies met at the Battle of Zuili. Goujian, outnumbered and facing the veteran legions of Wu, resorted to a tactic of stunning psychological warfare. According to the ancient historian Sima Qian, Goujian placed a line of convicted criminals in the front rank of his army. As the Wu forces advanced, these men on command all drew their swords and slit their own throats. The Wu soldiers, hardened veterans of many campaigns, were completely unnerved by this horrifying spectacle. They froze, staring in disbelief. It was a moment of sheer, calculated madness. In that moment of hesitation, Goujian's elite troops, hidden on the flanks, launched a furious assault. The Wu army was routed. During the chaotic battle, King Helu was struck by a Yue halberd and his toe was grievously wounded. The wound became infected, and the mighty king of Wu died shortly after. His final words to his son, Fuchai, a whispered command: "Never ever forget Yue." This set the stage for the next, even more vicious chapter of the rivalry. Fuchai, the new king of Wu, became a man possessed by a single, all-consuming purpose: vengeance. He made his obsession the official policy of the court. He reportedly had a guard stationed to shout at him every time he passed, "Fuchai, have you forgotten that the king of Yue killed your father?" To which Fuchai would have to reply, tears in his eyes, "I dare not forget." He drilled his army relentlessly and listened intently to his brilliant, if ruthless, advisor, the great strategist, Wu Zixu. The state of Wu became a finely honed weapon, aimed directly at Goujian. The warfare in this region was a specialized art. The great naval vessels of the time were marvels of engineering. These were not simple canoes. They were large, multi-decked ships called Great Wings, Dai Yi, propelled by dozens of oarsmen and carrying marines armed with crossbows and long hooked polearms for boarding enemy ships. Naval battles were chaotic affairs of ramming, volleys of arrows, and brutal deck-to-deck melees. This focus on naval power was one of the defining features of the Wu-Yue conflict. A quirky detail often lost in the grand sweep of history is that some of these ships were likely named much like modern naval vessels, with intimidating titles like the River Shaker or the Leaping Predator, turning these battles into a clash of fearsome reputations, as well as of arms. At the heart of Wu's military council was the aforementioned Wu Zixu, one of the most fascinating and tragic figures of the era. Historians still argue about the primary motivation of Wu Zixu, King Fuchai's most capable advisor. Was he a selfless patriot, dedicated only to the glory of Wu? Or was he a man driven by his own personal demons? Wu Zixu had escaped from the state of Chu after his own father and brother were executed by the king there. His single-minded goal for years had been to get revenge on Chu, which he finally achieved while serving Fuchai's father. His subsequent advice to Fuchai, to utterly destroy Yue and absorb its territory, was born of a deep, cynical understanding of the brutal nature of power in their time. He knew that a wounded enemy would only return stronger. Goujian, however, was not content to wait for the storm to break. Puffed up with the confidence from his victory at Zuili, he made a fatal miscalculation. In 494 BCE, hearing that Fuchai's army was finally on the move, Goujian decided to launch a preemptive strike, ignoring the advice of his own cautious ministers. He marched his army north to meet the Wu invasion head-on. The two kings, one burning with youthful confidence, the other with a cold fire of vengeance, were on a collision course. The cycle of violence was about to turn once more, and this time, it would be Goujian who would be crushed beneath its weight. Beginning a chapter of his life so humiliating, it would become a legend. The confidence that led you to this battlefield now feels like a distant, foolish dream. You are with King Goujian at the Battle of Fujiao in 494 BCE, and the preemptive strike against the state of Wu has turned into an absolute catastrophe. The army of King Fuchai, drilled to perfection and burning with the need for vengeance, has not just defeated your forces, it has annihilated them. The Yue army breaks, scatters, and is cut down. The defeat is so total, so devastating that you, as Goujian, are forced into a desperate retreat with the last pathetic remnants of your royal guard, a mere 5,000 soldiers. You flee to the slopes of nearby Mount Quaiji, a defensible position but also a trap. Soon, the entire mountain is swarming with the banners of Wu. Every escape route is cut off. You are surrounded. Your meager forces a tiny island in a sea of enemy soldiers. The air is thick with the dust of defeat and the metallic scent of blood. As the siege tightens, your advisors present you with the grim final options. You can lead your remaining men in one last glorious suicidal charge down the mountain, dying an honorable warrior's death and ending the feud then and there. Or you can choose a path of almost unthinkable dishonor. You can surrender. You can formally submit yourself to Fuchai, beg for your life, and pray for mercy. It's your minister, Wen Zhong, who argues for the latter, pleading that as long as you are alive, the state of Yue has a future. In this moment, you make the decision that will define your legend. You choose survival over honor. You swallow the burning acid of your pride and send envoys down the mountain to plead for terms. Fuchai, ignoring the vehement protests of his advisor Wu Zixu, who demands your immediate execution, agrees. He will spare your life, but the price will be your dignity. You are taken, along with your queen, back to the capital of Wu, not as a royal captive but as a common slave. The humiliation is absolute and public. You, King Goujian of Yue, a man for whom a sword of impossible quality was crafted, are now assigned to the royal stables. Your new home is a crude stone hut near the horse stalls. Your days are spent mucking out dung, grooming Fuchai's war horses and leading them to water. Fuchai takes great pleasure in your degradation. He parades you before visiting dignitaries, a living symbol of his triumph. He sometimes has you run alongside his chariot like a groom. For 3 years, this is your existence. Every day is a new lesson in shame, a new test of your will to endure. It is this period of suffering that gives birth to one of the most famous idioms in the Chinese language, Woxin Chang Dan, Woxin Chang Dan, which translates to sleeping on brushwood and tasting gall. The legend, as recorded by the great Han Dynasty historian Sima Qian, tells that after you eventually return to Yue, you transform your life into a constant, physical reminder of your humiliation. You remove your comfortable bed and sleep instead on a pile of rough, scratchy firewood. You hang a bitter gallbladder from the ceiling of your room, and several times a day, you look at it, and then you taste it, letting the vile flavor fill your mouth. It is a physical act of remembrance, ensuring that you never, for 1 second, forget the bitterness of your captivity. The comfort of a soft bed and the pleasure of good food are poisons that could dull the edge of your hatred. You choose to live in perpetual discomfort, nurturing your grudge, letting it grow into an all-consuming obsession. The turning point in your captivity comes from a moment of supreme, calculated debasement. King Fuchai falls gravely ill. His own physicians are baffled. You see your chance. Presenting yourself before the sick king, you make an audacious claim. You have some knowledge of medicine and can diagnose his ailment by tasting his stool. It's a shocking, repulsive offer. But Fuchai, desperate, agrees. You perform the deed, and after a moment of feigned contemplation, you declare with great confidence that the King Goujian's illness is not fatal, and that he will recover by a certain date. When, by sheer chance, Fuchai does indeed recover as you predicted, he is utterly convinced of your loyalty. Who but the most devoted, most broken slave would perform such a disgusting act? This is the moment that seals his trust. Of course, the line between history and legend here is incredibly thin. Historians still argue whether the most extreme tales of Goujian's servitude, such as tasting Fuchai's excrement, are historical facts or dramatic embellishments. It is possible these details were added later to make the story of his eventual revenge even more potent and morally satisfying. But real or not, the story serves its purpose. Fuchai now sees you not as a threat, but as a pathetic, loyal dog. He begins to consider releasing you. Wu Zixu, his wise old advisor, sees right through your performance. He pleads with Fuchai, warning him that a man willing to endure such shame is a man of terrifying will, a coiled snake that will surely strike if freed. Fuchai, blinded by his own arrogance and your masterful acting, ignores the warnings. After 3 long years, he officially pardons you and grants you permission to return to your homeland. You prostrate yourself, weeping with gratitude, playing the part of the broken man to the very end. As you journey back to Yue, you are no longer a king in chains, but a man who has passed through the darkest fires of humiliation and emerged with a spirit hardened into something far more dangerous than bronze. You have survived, and now your revenge begins. You stand with Goujian as he crosses the border back into his own kingdom of Yue. He is a changed man, a vessel of cold, patient fury, his true intentions hidden behind a mask of humility. He is about to embark on a 20-year project of national renewal and secret preparation for war. But for a moment, let us leave him at the threshold of his great revenge and travel back to the 20th century, back to the laboratory where his sword lies under the sterile lights. We know the name the inscription revealed, but now it's time to appreciate the sheer artistry of the message itself. The 8 characters that declare his ownership are a whisper from a lost world, and the style in which they are written is as remarkable as the blade they adorn. You lean closer, looking at the 2 columns of text. It's the bird-worm seal script, and it is pure artistic magic. This isn't writing as mere information. This is writing as illustration, as a statement of identity. It is a decorative variant of the more formal seal script that was the standard written language of the time. While a northern lord would have his name inscribed in a blocky, severe, and dignified script, the southern kings of Wu, Yue, and Chu opted for something far more flamboyant. The bird elements are the easiest to spot. Some characters have a flourish at the top that looks distinctly like the head and crest of a proud bird. The worm part is a bit of a misnomer. The strokes aren't really worm-like, but rather serpentine, sinuous and coiling like the body of a dragon or a snake. The entire inscription seems to writhe with a life of its own, a fusion of calligraphy and nature. The choice to use this script was a significant cultural and political statement. During the spring and autumn period, the states of the Central Plains, who saw themselves as the inheritors of the true Zhou culture, viewed the southern kingdoms as semi-barbaric upstarts. By developing and using such a unique and complex script on their most important ritual and military objects, the southern rulers were pushing back. They were declaring their own unique cultural identity. It was a sophisticated way of saying, "We are not you. We have our own traditions, our own aesthetic, and our own power." The Sword of Goujian, therefore, is not just a personal item. It's a piece of political branding, a symbol of Yue's regional pride and defiance. Imagine the sheer technical skill required to create this. The inscription was not carved into the finished sword. Instead, the characters had to be meticulously inscribed, in reverse, into the delicate inner surfaces of the clay piece molds before the molten bronze was poured. The artisan had to be a master calligrapher and a master sculptor simultaneously, working on a tiny scale, where a single misplaced stroke would ruin the entire piece. It's an act of precision that is difficult to comprehend even with modern tools. The result is an inscription that is literally part of the sword's soul, cast into its very essence. The symbolism of the creatures woven into the text is deeply significant. Birds, particularly elegant cranes or mythical phoenixes, were powerful symbols in ancient China, representing longevity, good fortune, and a connection to the heavens. Dragons or serpents were emblems of terrestrial power, transformation, and control over the waters that were so central to life in Yue. By weaving these creatures into the characters of his own name, Goujian was doing something more than just signing his work. He was creating a powerful talisman. The inscription effectively says, "The divine favor of the heavens, the birds, and the formidable power of the earth, the serpents, are fused with the identity of King Goujian." It's a statement of cosmic authority. This idea of writing as a source of power is an ancient one. You can see this script as a sort of aristocratic ancestor to the Fu, or magical talismans, that would become central to later Taoist practices. Taoist priests would draw complex esoteric characters on paper or wood to heal the sick, protect a home, or even command spirits. They believed the act of writing the symbol correctly could channel supernatural energies. In the same way, the birdworm script on Goujian's sword likely wasn't just for decoration. It was there to imbue the weapon with a magical potency, to make it not just sharp but lucky, not just deadly but divinely sanctioned. Naturally, something this complex invites debate. Epigraphers and art historians still debate whether birdworm seal script evolved primarily as an anti-counterfeiting measure or as a purely aesthetic expression of regional pride. On the one hand, the sheer difficulty of reproducing the script would have made it an excellent security feature, ensuring that only the royal workshops could produce an authentic weapon for the king. On the other hand, the artistic variations and sheer beauty suggest that the primary motivation was a desire to create objects of unparalleled aesthetic and symbolic richness. The truth, most likely, is that it was both. A beautiful expression of power that was also devilishly hard to copy. Looking at the elegant, twisting characters, you gain another insight into the mind of Goujian, a man who would later use grand psychological gestures and symbolic self-punishment to fuel his revenge, was clearly a man who understood the power of perception. His choice of this script shows a deep appreciation for the way art and symbolism could project power. The sword was the reality of his military might, but the inscription was the propaganda, the magical invocation that elevated it from a mere tool to a sacred object. It's a final, beautiful layer on an already perfect artifact, a reminder that every detail here was a choice, reflecting the mind of a king and the culture of a kingdom. You're back in the lab. In front of you, the sword lies on a velvet cloth, the 8 characters of its inscription a silent, beautiful enigma. We have the advantage of hindsight, the convenience of a neat, 8-word translation handed to us by decades of scholarship. But for the team of researchers in 1965, staring at these bird-like serpentine glyphs, the sword might as well have been from another planet. It presented a locked room mystery, and the key was buried under 2,500 years of linguistic evolution. Giving this sword its voice back would require an intellectual journey every bit as challenging as the physical excavation of the tomb itself. It would require a Rosetta Stone moment. Now, when you hear Rosetta Stone, you think of that one magical slab of rock with 3 languages on it that unlocked the secrets of Egyptian hieroglyphs. But here, the Rosetta Stone wasn't a single object. It was the collective, painstakingly accumulated knowledge of a generation of scholars. The task of deciphering the inscription fell to a team of China's most brilliant epigraphers and historians, men like Guo Moruo, who had dedicated their lives to the study of ancient bronze inscriptions known as Zhaowen, Jinwen, or text on metal. Their challenge was immense. The birdworm seal script wasn't just old, it was an artistic dialect of an already archaic language. It's like trying to read Shakespeare, but the only copy you have is written in graffiti-style bubble letters, with a whole lot of extra, decorative swoops. The core of the problem lies in the history of the Chinese language itself. For centuries during the Shang and Zhou dynasties, different regions and states developed their own local variations of the written script. It wasn't until 221 BCE, more than 2 centuries after this sword was forged, that the first emperor, Qin Shi Huang, undertook one of the most ambitious administrative projects in history, the standardization of the writing system. He abolished the scripts of the 6 states and enforced a single, unified script across his new empire. This act was crucial for creating a cohesive Chinese state. but it also consigned countless regional scripts, like the birdworm style, to the dustbin of history, turning them into fascinating but difficult puzzles for future generations. So how did the scholars even begin? You start with what you know. You're like a detective arriving at a crime scene. A few characters, even in their flamboyant disguises, were familiar. The character for King, Wang, a simple symbol of 3 horizontal lines and 1 vertical, is one of the most fundamental in the language. And the character for sword, Jian, was also identifiable from other less ornate weapon inscriptions. These were the anchors, the first solid handholds on a sheer cliff face of uncertainty. The scholars now knew the inscription likely read King of somewhere, and ended with something about a sword. Next, you use context. The sword was found in Hubei, in a tomb belonging to the state of Chu. But stylistically, it resembled artifacts from the coastal state of Yue. The historical records, particularly the epic chronicles of the Wu-Yue conflict, were their guidebook. They knew they were looking for a king's name from that specific region and that specific violent period. This dramatically narrowed the field of possibilities from hundreds of rulers to a handful. The most crucial character to identify was the one for Yue. By comparing the glyph on the sword to the character for Yue on other, more clearly written artifacts, they found a match in its underlying structure, despite the artistic flourishes. The sentence now read, King of Yue, someone, sword. The final and most difficult step was identifying the name itself, Goujian. This was the true aha moment. With the context of King of Yue established, the scholars could cross-reference the remaining 2 unknown characters against the names of the known kings of Yue. When they landed on Goujian, it all clicked into place. They could now see how the complex bird-headed character on the sword was a highly stylized version of the character for Ju, and the winding character below it was an artistic rendering of Jian. It was a brilliant piece of academic detective work, a process of elimination and comparative analysis that slowly, piece by piece, revealed the stunning truth. For a while, they must have worried they were dealing with ghost characters, Guizi, a paleographer's nightmare, characters that appear only once in the entire archaeological record, making their meaning pure guesswork. But thankfully, Goujian was a name that history had not forgotten. Even with the main message deciphered, subtleties remain. While the identification of Goujian, King of Yue, is universally accepted, scholars still debate the subtle nuances of the final 4 characters, Zizuoyongjian. The most direct translation is made this sword for his own personal use. But does personal use mean for battle? For court ceremony? Or does the phrase imply something more like personally commissioned for use? A way to emphasize that it came from the king's own royal workshop and was not a gift or tribute from a lesser state. The beautiful conciseness of classical Chinese leaves just enough ambiguity to keep academics writing papers about it to this day. The confirmation of the name was an earth-shattering moment. The artifact was instantly transformed. It was no longer the Wangshan Tomb No. 1 sword. It was the sword of King Goujian. This single, definitive piece of text elevated it from a stunning archaeological find to a national treasure of the highest possible order. It provided a direct, tangible link between a flawless artifact and one of the most dramatic legendary figures in all of Chinese history. After 2,500 years of silence in a watery tomb, the sword had finally spoken its name. The name is now known. The voice of the sword has been heard, speaking the name of King Goujian across a chasm of 25 centuries. The historical puzzle box has been opened, revealing a story of kings, rivalries, and revenge. But solving one mystery only throws another into sharper relief. You're no longer just asking, whose sword is this? You are now asking the question that will puzzle scientists for the next 50 years. How is this sword even here? To truly grasp the miracle of its existence, you first have to understand the fundamental, inescapable law that it breaks. You need a brief, slightly depressing primer on the inevitable decay of bronze. First things first, what even is bronze? It's not a pure element like gold or iron. It's an alloy, which is just a fancy word for a metal cocktail. The main ingredient is copper, to which you add a splash of something else to give it some backbone. In the case of classic bronze, that something else is tin. This discovery was one of the most important moments in human history, the catalyst for the entire Bronze Age. Adding about 10–12% tin to copper transforms it from a relatively soft, reddish metal into a much harder, more durable, golden-hued alloy that can be cast into tools, armor, and, of course, lethally sharp swords. When it was newly forged and polished, Goujian's sword would have shone with the warm, rich glow of a sunset. But like all things in this world, bronze is not built to last. It has a fundamental weakness, an Achilles heel woven into its very atomic structure. It is vulnerable to oxygen. The process is called oxidation, and you see it every day. It's the rust that blossoms on a bicycle left in the rain, the green that coats the copper dome of a city hall. Metal wants to return to its natural, more stable state, the state it was in as ore in the ground, and to do that, it reacts with the environment. For bronze, the main culprits are oxygen, water, and any other corrosive agents hanging around in the soil, like chlorides and sulfides. This reaction creates a new layer on the surface of the metal, what we call a patina. Sometimes a patina can be a good thing. On a bronze statue in a park, a stable dark brown or black layer of copper oxide can form, which actually seals the metal underneath from further corrosion. It's like a protective scab. But in the wrong environment, like say a tomb that has been filled with water for 2,500 years, the process becomes malignant. This is where you get the dreaded bronze disease. Triggered by moisture and salts, a runaway chemical reaction begins, causing ugly, powdery, light green spots to erupt on the surface. It's called a disease for a good reason. It's contagious, spreading from one spot to another, and it's chronic, slowly but relentlessly eating away at the artifact. The bronze doesn't just get a coating, it is fundamentally consumed, its metallic structure converted into a fragile lattice of mineral salts. So when archaeologists opened that waterlogged tomb in 1965, they had a very clear expectation of what any bronze inside should look like. A sword should have been a tragic sight, a lumpy, swollen object coated in a thick, crusty blue-green shell of corrosion. Its edges would be eaten away, its surface pitted and unrecognizable. It would be so fragile that trying to lift it might cause it to snap under its own weight, crumbling into a pile of greenish dust and broken dreams. This is the normal, scientifically expected fate of ancient bronze. The fact that the Terracotta Army's bronze weapons were also found in an amazing state of preservation is a key parallel. This discovery in the 1970s showed that Chinese metallurgists of the broader period had developed remarkable preservation techniques, creating a pattern of exceptions to the rule of decay. And yet, here is the Sword of Goujian, which didn't just escape the worst of this fate, but seems to have escaped it entirely. It has no thick crust, no powdery green disease. It has no significant patina at all. It gleams. It's a chemical impossibility, an affront to the laws of thermodynamics. It is an artifact that seems to have simply refused to age. You can almost imagine the scent in that tomb, the earthy smell of wet clay, the musty odor of decaying wood, and the sharp metallic tang of all the other bronze artifacts that were corroding exactly as they should be. The Sword of Goujian in its lacquered scabbard would have been an island of neutrality in that sensory landscape, another uncanny sign that it was playing by a different set of rules. This impossible preservation immediately cleaved the scientific community into two broad camps, a fundamental debate that in some ways continues to this day. One side proposed that the sword's condition must be the result of a deliberate lost technology. They argued that the ancient smiths of Yue possessed a secret, sophisticated anti-corrosion treatment that they applied to the blade, a piece of chemical wizardry that we have yet to fully understand. The other camp argued for a happy accident theory. They proposed that it was the result of a perfect storm of favorable, but ultimately accidental conditions, a unique bronze alloy, a perfectly sealed scabbard, and the specific oxygen-free chemistry of the water in the tomb. Was it human genius or incredible luck? This is the question that shifts the sword's journey from the domain of history to the domain of materials science. The artifact is now a patient on the operating table, It's time to put it under the microscope, to bombard it with X-rays, to analyze its every molecule. The quest to understand how it survived is on, a scientific investigation into a 2,500-year-old miracle. The quest to solve the mystery of the Sword of Goujian begins not with a grand theory, but with a quiet, methodical analysis in the lab. The first order of business is to get a definitive answer to the most basic question: what exactly is this thing made of? In the 1960s and 70s, this meant using techniques like X-ray fluorescence, a clever method that bathes an object in X-rays and then reads the unique energy signatures that each element emits in response. It's a way of asking the sword what it's made of without cutting off a piece for a biopsy. The initial results come back, and on the surface they are entirely expected. The sword is, as everyone knew, bronze. The primary ingredients are copper and tin. But as the scientists look closer at the data, mapping the composition across different parts of the blade, a far more complex and brilliant picture begins to emerge. They discover that the Sword of Goujian is not made from a single uniform recipe of bronze. It is a masterpiece of composite engineering, a single blade forged from two distinct alloys, each chosen for its specific physical properties. The spine of the sword, its central ridge and core, is made of a bronze with a lower percentage of tin. This alloy is softer, more ductile, and significantly more flexible. It gives the sword the ability to bend and absorb the shock of impact without shattering. This is the sword's toughness, its resilience. If you were to parry a blow from a heavy axe, this flexible core is what would prevent your blade from snapping in two. But the edges of the sword tell a different story. The analysis shows that the two cutting edges are composed of a separate bronze alloy with a much higher concentration of tin, likely exceeding 20%. High tin bronze is the polar opposite of its low tin cousin. It is incredibly hard, almost as hard as some forms of modern carbon steel. This hardness allows it to be honed to a terrifyingly sharp, durable edge. This is the sword's lethality. The ancient smiths who created this blade managed to solve the fundamental dilemma that has plagued sword makers for all of history: the trade-off between hardness and toughness. A very hard sword is usually brittle, while a very tough sword is often too soft to hold a good edge. The Sword of Goujian refuses to compromise. It has a tough, resilient core and brutally hard, sharp edges. It is, in essence, two swords in one. This wasn't a lucky accident. It was the product of a sophisticated and mature science of metallurgy. We know this because their techniques are actually documented. An ancient Chinese text called the Rites of Zhou, which contains a fascinating section known as the Caogongji, or Record of Trades, serves as a kind of technical manual for the Zhou dynasty. It lays out the precise recipes for bronze casting, specifying different ratios of copper and tin for different objects. It lists 6 primary formulas for making bells, axes, halberds, and swords. The chemical composition of Goujian's sword, with its different alloys for the spine and edge, aligns remarkably well with the recipes prescribed in this ancient text. This proves that the sword wasn't a singular miracle. It was the product of a standardized, well-understood, and highly advanced technological tradition. The sheer technical skill required to forge such a blade is staggering. The leading theory is that it was created using a complex multi-stage casting process. The smiths would have first cast the 2 hard, high tin edges in separate molds. Once these had cooled and solidified, they would be carefully placed inside a larger sword-shaped mold. Then, the molten, lower tin bronze for the spine and body would be poured into the space between them. The searing heat of this second pour would partially melt the surface of the edges, fusing all 3 pieces together on a molecular level. It's an incredibly delicate operation, a dance with temperature and timing that leaves absolutely no room for error. The analysis also revealed trace amounts of other elements, including a small percentage of lead. Now, lead does nothing to improve the strength of bronze. In fact, too much would make it dangerously weak. But a little bit of lead acts as a flux, making the molten alloy more fluid. Think of it as adding a little water to thick paint to make it spread more evenly. This added fluidity would help the molten bronze penetrate every minute, decorative detail of the mold, including the intricate birdworm script of the inscription. It was another subtle touch, another sign of a master craftsman who understood every property of his materials. So this complex and brilliant design explains the sword's legendary sharpness and resilience. But does it explain its resistance to corrosion? Here, we enter another rich area of academic discussion. Metallurgists still debate whether the specific alloy ratios were the primary factor in the sword's corrosion resistance, or merely a contributor. High tin bronze is, as a matter of chemistry, more stable and less reactive than bronze with a high copper content. Did the smiths choose this alloy for the edges primarily for its anti-rust properties, or did they choose it for its hardness, and its incredible resistance to decay was simply a wonderful and unintended side effect? Either way, you can't help but see the parallel between the sword-ass construction and the character of the king who owned it. The blade's design, a flexible, resilient core that won't break under pressure, fused to lethally hard, uncompromising edges, is a perfect metaphor for Goujian himself. He was the king who could bend, who could endure the ultimate humiliation as a slave in the stables of Wu, but who never lost the sharp, hard edge of his purpose. The sword is more than just his weapon. It is his biography, written in 2 alloys of bronze. The first layer of the mystery has been peeled back, revealing not a simple metal, but a complex and intelligent machine. The discovery of the sword's bimetallic construction was a monumental leap forward. It explained its legendary strength and sharpness, revealing the blade to be a product of deliberate, sophisticated engineering. But it didn't fully solve the central riddle of its preservation. The high tin content of the edges certainly helped, as tin is more resistant to corrosion than copper, but it couldn't account for the almost complete lack of patina on the entire blade. The scientific investigators knew there had to be another piece to the puzzle. They moved their analysis from the bulk metal of the sword's interior to its very surface, and what they found there in the mid-1970s would ignite a firestorm of controversy that still smolders to this day. It was a single, unexpected element: chromium. When the surface of the sword was analyzed, the instruments detected trace amounts of chromium salt. To a layperson, that might not sound like much. But to a metallurgist, this was like finding a perfectly preserved smartphone in the tomb of Tutankhamun. Chromium is a modern miracle metal. It's a hard, lustrous, silvery element that is spectacularly resistant to tarnishing and corrosion. It's the key ingredient that makes steel stainless. It's the shimmering, mirror-like coating on classic car bumpers and modern kitchen faucets. We think of it as a hallmark of 20th century industrial chemistry, so you can imagine the shock when it was found on a 2,500-year-old sword. The initial conclusion was as spectacular as it was controversial. The ancient smiths of Yue had invented a form of chromate conversion coating, an advanced chemical treatment to make the sword rust-proof. This theory spread like wildfire through both academic circles and the popular press. It was an irresistible story, a lost high-tech secret, a piece of chemical wizardry far ahead of its time. It has the kind of discovery that makes you want to check the corners of the tomb for scorch marks from a DeLorean's tires. To put this in perspective, chromium as a distinct element wasn't even discovered until 1797 by the French chemist Louis-Nicolas Vauquelin. The industrial processes for electroplating objects with a protective layer of chromium were not perfected until the 1920s. The proposition that a Bronze Age craftsman, working in a smoky forge on the banks of the Yangtze River, had developed a process that wouldn't be rediscovered for another 2.5 millennia was staggering. It would fundamentally rewrite the global history of science and technology. This sensational theory got a massive boost a few years later with the excavation of the first Emperor's terracotta army. Archaeologists there were stunned to find that the bronze weapons carried by the clay soldiers, swords, crossbow triggers, and spear tips, were also in a near-perfect state of preservation. And when these were analyzed, they too were found to have a surface layer containing chromium. This seemed to be the smoking gun. It wasn't just a fluke in one tomb. Here was evidence from another site, hundreds of miles away, and from a slightly later period, showing the same impossible technology. The case for an ancient, sophisticated, and perhaps widespread Chinese anti-corrosion science seemed all but closed. But great claims require great evidence, and a new generation of scientists began to pick at the threads of this fantastic theory. They started asking tougher questions. If this technology existed, why wasn't it used on everything? Why are most other bronze artifacts from the period, even very high-status ones, found in a corroded state? The new theory they proposed was far less romantic, but it had the distinct advantage of fitting the facts more neatly. They argued the chromium wasn't an intentional coating, but an accidental contaminant from the sword's immediate environment. This counter-theory, the happy accident model, proposed two likely sources for the chromium. The first was the soil itself. The earth in that region of Hubei province is naturally rich in chromium compounds. Over 2,500 years, groundwater seeping into the tomb could have become a kind of chromium-rich chemical bath, slowly depositing a thin, protective layer of chromium salts onto the surface of the sword. The second, and perhaps more compelling explanation, had to do with the black lacquer used to coat the wooden scabbard. Ancient artisans were known to mix all sorts of strange ingredients into their lacquer to act as pigments, hardeners, or preservatives. It's entirely plausible they used a local, chromium-rich mineral compound in the lacquer mixture, having no idea of its specific elemental properties, only that it produced a good result. In the snug, airtight environment of the scabbard, a chemical interaction over the centuries could have transferred a microscopic layer of chromium from the lacquer to the blade. The central question that ignited decades of research and publications is this: was the chromium on the Sword of Goujian an intentional, technologically advanced coating, or an accidental contaminant from its environment? The latest, most detailed studies using powerful modern electron microscopes have found that the chromium is not a uniform layer, as you would expect from a deliberate coating process. Instead, it's patchy and most concentrated in the grooves and decorative patterns, suggesting a liquid-based deposition from the environment. The evidence today leans heavily towards the chromium being a lucky accident rather than a lost science. But the original, more romantic notion of ancient chrome plating is so powerful that it remains a popular fact about the sword to this day, a testament to our desire to believe in the forgotten genius of the past. The chromium conundrum is a perfect lesson in how science is a process of constant questioning, where the most exciting theory isn't always the right one. So, the shiny allure of ancient chrome plating has given way to a more complex and subtle scientific debate. While the metallurgists argue about the origins of the trace elements on the sword's surface, another group of specialists, the archaeologists and hydrologists, are looking at the bigger picture. They re-zooming out from the molecular level of the blade to the architectural level of the tomb itself. They suggest that to find the real secret of the sword's preservation, you don't need to look for a lost technology. You just need to look at the room it was stored in for 2.5 millennia, and it turns out, tomb number 1 at Wangshan was no ordinary room. It was a near-perfect natural time capsule. Your first instinct, and a perfectly reasonable one, is to think of water as the enemy of preservation. Water causes rust, rot, and mold. It dissolves and destroys. But in this very specific case, the water that flooded Goujian's tomb was not the villain of the story. It was the unlikely hero. The key to this paradox is not the presence of water, but the resulting absence of something else: oxygen. The tomb had become an anoxic environment, a place without air. Here's how you, as a Chu tomb builder, would accidentally create one of the world's most effective preservation chambers. First, you dig a deep pit, well below the local water table. Then, you line the outside of your wooden burial chamber with a thick layer of charcoal, which helps absorb moisture during construction. Crucially, you then pack the entire structure with a dense, sticky grayish-white clay, a material that is abundant in the region. This clay is far less permeable to water and air than ordinary soil. Once you place the coffins and grave goods inside, you seal the chamber and pile a huge earthen mound on top. Over the next few months and years, groundwater from the surrounding earth inevitably begins to seep in through the microscopic pores in the clay. As the water level inside rises, it pushes the existing air out. Eventually, the tomb is completely flooded, and the dense clay seal around it prevents any fresh oxygenated water or air from circulating inside. This lack of oxygen is the magic ingredient. Almost all of the processes of decay that we are familiar with are driven by oxygen. The chemical reaction that causes bronze to corrode is oxidation. The bacteria and fungi that cause wood, silk, and flesh to rot are, for the most part, aerobic. They need oxygen to live and do their destructive work. By removing the oxygen from the equation, you effectively press the pause button on time. The processes of decay don't stop entirely, but they slow down to a geological crawl. The tomb became a giant, subterranean, naturally occurring vacuum-sealed bag. This phenomenon isn't unique to this one tomb. You see the same principle at work in the peat bogs of northern Europe, which are famous for producing the incredibly well-preserved bog bodies. Figures like Tolland Man from Denmark were thrown into a bog over 2,000 years ago and were discovered in the 20th century with their skin, hair, and even the expressions on their faces eerily intact. This was possible because the unique chemistry of the bog, highly acidic and extremely low in oxygen, perfectly pickled them, arresting the natural process of decay. The waterlogged tomb of the Chu nobleman was a similar, if less acidic, kind of environment. It's also important to remember the care that went into the tomb's construction. This wasn't just a hole in the ground. The use of the charcoal and clay packing and the construction of massive nested coffins, a large outer coffin containing a smaller, more finely decorated inner one, created multiple barriers against the outside world. Each layer added to the stability and the seal. It's a bit ironic that the builder's primary motivation was almost certainly security against tomb robbers, not long-term chemical preservation. And yet, in the process of creating a physically secure space, they accidentally created a chemically perfect one. It's another point for the happy accident theory. You can't help but wonder if some early form of feng shui played a role, while the fully developed system of geomancy we know today came later. Its core principles, the art of finding a spiritually auspicious and harmonious location for a tomb or a building, were already taking shape. A master diviner would have been consulted to find a spot with the right energy, the right relationship to hills and water, to ensure the spirit of the deceased would be at peace. It's a delightful thought that in their search for a spiritually perfect location, they stumbled upon a chemically perfect one. Of course, this raises a tantalizing question for which there is no easy answer. Archaeologists and engineers continue to debate whether the Chu builders had an empirical understanding of these preservation principles. Is it possible that through generations of experience, they noticed that tombs built in this specific way, with these materials, tended to yield better preserved grave goods? Or were they simply following a rigid set of traditional and ritualistic building plans, completely unaware that their methods would create a time capsule for the ages? We may never know if it was accidental genius or just plain luck. But what is clear is that the tomb itself is a massive piece of the preservation puzzle. It created a quiet, dark, stable, and oxygen-free sanctuary that effectively put a 2,500-year-old crime scene on lockdown. This macro environment explains how anything survived in good condition, but it still doesn't explain why the sword survived in perfect condition. To understand that, we have to zoom in again, from the tomb to the sword's own personal bodyguard, the snug, black, lacquered scabbard it was resting in. We've established the genius of the tomb, a vast waterlogged, oxygen-free vault that acted as a giant preservation chamber. It was the ultimate safe deposit box. But within that box, the sword had its own personal, custom-fitted security system. It's an object that is almost always overlooked, a mere accessory to the gleaming star of the show. But without it, the sword would be a green, corroded stick. It is time to pay our respects to the unsung hero of this entire story, the lacquered wooden scabbard. When you think of lacquer, you probably picture a thick, glossy coating on a modern piece of furniture or a decorative box. But ancient Chinese lacquer was a different beast entirely. It was a remarkable natural substance, the processed sap of the Toxicodendron vernicifluum, or lacquer tree. And if that Latin name sounds vaguely familiar, it should. The tree is a close relative of poison ivy and poison sumac. The raw sap is a caustic, allergenic nightmare, and the craft of a lacquer artisan was a hazardous one, requiring a long and painful process of building up immunity to the toxic fumes and skin contact. It was not a job for the faint of heart, but the results were worth the risk. When this sap is filtered, treated, and applied in thin layers, it doesn't just dry like paint. It cures through a process of polymerization, creating a substance that is, for all intents and purposes, a natural plastic. This cured lacquer is astonishingly durable. It's waterproof, resistant to heat, and impervious to acids, alkalis, and insects. It's also breathtakingly beautiful, capable of being polished to a deep, lustrous sheen. In ancient China, particularly in the Chu state where the craft reached its zenith, the finest lacquerware was a super luxury item, often considered more valuable than bronze or even jade. The sword's scabbard was a product of this elite tradition. It was constructed from a core of wood, which was then coated in dozens of painstaking layers of this miraculous substance. Each layer had to be applied and then allowed to cure in a carefully controlled environment, a warm, humid, and dust-free chamber, before the next could be added. This meticulous process created a shell around the wood that was strong, inert, and most importantly, almost completely non-porous. While the raw wood inside would have been susceptible to rot, this lacquer shell was a suit of high-tech chemical armor. But the true genius of the scabbard wasn't just its material, it was its fit. The interior of the scabbard was crafted to the exact dimensions of the blade with microscopic precision. The fit was so snug that when the sword was sheathed, it created a near-perfect, airtight seal. The mouth of the scabbard fit the hilt guard like a key in a lock. When the sword was slid home for the last time before being placed in the tomb, a very small, finite amount of air was trapped inside with it. In the initial hours or days, this trapped oxygen would have been consumed by the very first tinges of oxidation on the bronze surface. But once that tiny bit of oxygen was gone, the chemical reactions would stop. The inside of the scabbard became its own private, oxygen-free microenvironment, a sanctuary within the sanctuary of the tomb. This was the sword's first and most critical line of defense. The oxygen-free water of the tomb was the backup generator. For 2,500 years, the lacquer shell prevented the tomb's water from ever coming into direct contact with the blade. The sword didn't sit in water. It sat in a tiny pocket of inert, ancient air, which was in turn surrounded by water. The tightness of the fit was no exaggeration. The archaeologists who discovered it reported that it took a surprising amount of force to draw the blade for the first time, the seal of millennia resisting them. This incredible precision naturally leads to a debate. Craft historians and archaeologists still debate whether the scabbard's astonishingly tight fit was a standard feature of high-quality weapons or a specific, perhaps custom, innovation for this blade. Was this level of craftsmanship the norm for a king's sword, and we just don't see it because most wooden scabbards have long since turned to dust? Or was the fit on Goujian's scabbard a unique masterpiece of the craft, making it a crucial and exceptional element in its own preservation story? So now the full picture of the happy accident theory comes into focus. It wasn't one single factor, but a perfect cascade of protective measures. First, you have the blade itself, forged from advanced bronze alloys with an inherently high resistance to corrosion. Second, you have the scabbard, a masterpiece of lacquerwork, providing a perfectly sealed, oxygen-free microenvironment. And third, you have the tomb, a larger, stable, anoxic chamber that protected the scabbard itself from decay. It was a Russian doll of preservation. The gleaming sword may get all the glory, but it's the humble black scabbard that was its true guardian. It was the silent sentinel that held back the relentless tide of chemistry for 25 centuries. With this final piece of the environmental puzzle in place, our journey can now turn from the why of its survival to the how of its creation. We must now travel back in time to the fiery, smoky workshops of the Kingdom of Yue to ask, how in the world did they actually make this thing? You've explored the tomb, the scabbard, and the very atoms of the sword. The story of its survival is a complex tale of chemistry and lucky circumstances. Now it's time to leave the quiet, sterile laboratory and travel back to a place of fire, smoke, and creative violence. You are stepping into a royal workshop in the Kingdom of Yue, around 475 BCE. The air is hot and thick with the tang of burning charcoal and the sharp scent of hot metal. This is where the sword was born, and the process of its creation was a form of alchemy, a blend of high science and ritual magic. Now, when you picture sword making, your mind probably conjures a familiar image: a burly, sweat-soaked blacksmith rhythmically hammering a glowing orange bar of metal on a massive anvil, sparks flying with every strike. That is forging, the art of shaping metal by heating it and beating it. It is how iron and steel swords from Viking blades to Japanese katanas were made. But bronze is a different animal. You don't hammer a bronze sword into shape. You give it form in a single fiery birth. You cast it. The primary technology for this in ancient China was a sophisticated method known as piece mold casting. This technique was in many ways far more advanced than the lost wax method used in ancient Greece, Rome, and Egypt. It allowed for greater precision, finer detail, and the ability to create complex composite objects like Goujian's sword. Let's walk through the process. You are the master craftsman, and this legendary blade is your next project. Your work begins not with metal, but with clay. You first create a perfect master model of the sword you wish to create. This is not a rough sketch. It is a flawless 1.1 replica, likely made of a fine, easily worked clay. Every detail must be exact. The gentle taper of the blade, the precise geometry of the central ridge, the intricate guard and pommel. This model is the platonic ideal of the sword. Once it is perfect, you take fresh, damp slabs of a different, coarser clay and carefully press them against your master model in sections. You might have 2 large pieces for the front and back of the blade, and several smaller, more intricate pieces for the hilt. You allow these sections to dry, then carefully remove them and fire them in a kiln. They emerge as hard, ceramic negative impressions of the sword, the pieces of your piece mold. Now for the brilliant part that allows for the bimetallic blade. You take your 2 precast, high-tin bronze edges, which were created earlier in a similar, simpler process, and you carefully set them inside your newly fired ceramic mold. They fit into place like pieces of a puzzle, defining the final shape of the blade and leaving a perfectly sword-shaped empty space between them. This empty space is where the flexible lower tin bronze of the spine will go. The day of the pour is the day of judgment. The crucible, a massive ceramic pot, is heated in the furnace until it glows white-hot. Inside, your carefully measured recipe of copper and tin liquefies into a molten, incandescent soup, shimmering at a temperature of over 1,000 degrees Celsius. We know from ancient texts like the Goujian that these smiths were masters of thermodynamics. They knew that different bronze alloys had different melting points and cooled at different rates, and they had to manage this complex science to prevent the final casting from cracking from thermal stress. With the mold securely assembled and braced, you and your assistants lift the crucible from the furnace. This was not just a technical process, it was a deeply spiritual one. A master smith was seen as part magician. The timing of the pour might be dictated by astrological charts. Incense would be burned, and prayers or sacrifices might be offered to the furnace gods to ensure their favor. A failed casting was not just a technical error, it was a bad omen. With a steady hand, you tip the crucible, and a glowing river of liquid bronze flows into the mold through channels called sprues. It floods the cavity, surrounding the high tin edges. The intense heat of this new metal fuses it to the precast edges at a molecular level. There is a hiss and a plume of steam, and then silence as the metal begins to cool. Archaeologists and craft historians still debate the exact materials used for the finest molds and cores. Was the mold made of simple kaolin clay? Or was it a complex ceramic recipe? Perhaps with fine sand, ash, or even organic materials like chopped straw or horse manure mixed in. These additives would have controlled the mold's porosity and thermal properties, preventing it from shrinking or cracking under the intense heat shock of the pour. The secret recipe of the mold was likely as closely guarded as the recipe for the bronze itself. After hours of slow, careful cooling, the moment of truth arrives. The outer ceramic mold is carefully chipped away. What emerges is a single solid piece of metal. The spine and the 2 edges are now one, a unified blade of 2 alloys. But it's not yet the beautiful object you know. It's a rough, dull, brownish gold casting, with excess metal flashing along the seams where the mold pieces met. It has the form of the Sword of Goujian, but it does not yet have its spirit. It is a perfect body without a soul. That must be worked into it through the next stages of its creation. The violent, transformative processes that will give the blade its hardness, its legendary edge, and its final lethal beauty. The sword lies before you on a stone block, cool to the touch. It is a single solid piece, the two alloys of its body fused into a perfect whole. But in this state, fresh from the mold, it is a promise unfulfilled. The slow cooling process has left the metal in a relatively soft or annealed state. It's a sword in shape only. A strong blow would bend it. Its edge would dull after a single strike. It lacks a soul. To give it one, you, the master smith, must now subject it to a brutal and transformative ordeal. You must command the very elements of fire and water to give the blade its true strength. You're going to quench it. Quenching is the heart of heat treatment, a process that sounds simple but is, in practice, a form of high-stakes alchemy. The basic idea is to heat a metal to a specific, critical temperature and then cool it down with shocking rapidity, usually by plunging it into a liquid. Think of it this way. The casting process was about getting the right ingredients and mixing them into the right shape. Quenching is the flash baking process that fundamentally changes the internal structure of the material, turning the soft dough of the cast bronze into the hard, finished cake of a weapon. It's not just a surface treatment. It's a profound, violent rearrangement of the metal's crystalline soul. Here's what's happening on a microscopic level. As you heat the bronze, the neat, orderly crystal structures of the copper and tin atoms begin to break down and rearrange themselves into a different, high-temperature configuration. If you were to let the metal cool slowly, the atoms would have time to calmly resettle into their original, stable, and relatively soft arrangement. But when you quench it, you plunge the hot metal into cold water, and the sudden, catastrophic drop in temperature gives the atoms no time to go home. They are frozen in place, trapped in the chaotic, high-energy state. This new, stressed-out, and distorted crystal structure is what gives the metal its extreme hardness. You take the cleaned, rough sword and place it carefully into a long, narrow forge filled with glowing charcoal. This is a delicate process. You aren't trying to melt the metal, just raise its temperature with perfect uniformity. You use a bellows to control the airflow and the heat, your eyes fixed on the blade. You are watching for a specific color, the only thermometer you have. The metal begins to glow, shifting from a dull black to a faint cherry red, then to a brighter, more insistent crimson. This is the art of the smith. A lifetime of experience is distilled into this one moment of judging the perfect temperature by color alone. The ancient text, the Goujian, with its obsessive focus on precise results, hints at this level of process control. It suggests a world where smiths were not just laborers but scientists, working with a deep, empirical knowledge of their materials. When the color is right, you move with a speed and grace born of 1,000 repetitions. You draw the glowing sword from the fire. For a moment, it hangs in the smoky air, a line of captive sunset. Then, in one smooth, decisive motion, you plunge it, edge first, into a long trough filled with water. The world explodes in a sensory assault. There is a violent, percussive hiss as the cold water flashes into steam. A huge white cloud erupts, momentarily obscuring everything. You hear a high-pitched, resonant scream from the metal itself, the sound of 1 billion crystals being instantly and brutally locked into their new, hardened form. This process would have selectively amplified the sword's brilliant design. The high tin edges, being more susceptible to this kind of hardening, would become incredibly hard and brittle. The lower tin spine, with its different chemical makeup, would be less affected, retaining its inherent flexibility and toughness. The quenching, therefore, didn't just harden the sword. It performed a kind of differential hardening, pushing the properties of the two alloys to their extremes. But this moment is fraught with peril. The internal stresses created by quenching are immense. If your temperature was even slightly off, if there was a microscopic flaw or air bubble in the original casting, or if you plunged the blade at the wrong angle, causing one side to cool faster than the other, the sword could warp into a useless pretzel or, worse, crack with a sickening ping. To lose a nearly finished masterpiece at this final, fiery baptism would be a catastrophe. Metallurgists and experimental archaeologists still debate the precise quenching medium used by the Yue smiths. Was it simple river water, or brine, salt water, which extracts heat more quickly for a more extreme hardening effect? Or did they use oil, which cools the metal more slowly, providing a less severe quench that reduces the risk of cracking? The legends, of course, provide far more lurid options. Myths from cultures all over the world tell of master smiths quenching their most powerful blades not in water, but in animal blood, or even in the bodies of living people, believing the weapon would absorb the life force of the quenching medium. While this is almost certainly fantasy, it speaks to the awe and mystery that surrounded this transformative and seemingly magical process. You pull the sword from the water. It is now dark, covered in a black fire scale, dripping and inert. But it is not the same object that went into the flames. You can feel a change in it. Tap it on the stone and instead of a dull thud, it now rings with a clear, high-pitched tone. It has survived its ordeal. It has been given its temper, its hardness, its soul. The fire and water have awakened the spirit of the blade. The sword emerges from the quenching bath, transformed. It is hard, resonant, and alive with internal tension. But it is also ugly, cloaked in the dull black fire scale left by its trial in the forge. It is a diamond in the rough, its true beauty still hidden. You are now the finisher, the artisan whose job it is to reveal the soul that the smith has forged into the metal. Your work is slow, patient, and laborious. You take the blade to a grinding stone, then begin the long process of polishing it with progressively finer abrasives, powdered stones, sand, and perhaps a leather strop. For hours you work, drawing the length of the blade across the polishing surface, and as the dark, rough scale is stripped away, something miraculous begins to appear. Beneath the grime, the surface of the blade is not a uniform golden bronze. A pattern emerges, a design of breathtaking complexity and precision. It is a repeating geometric grid of small, dark gray rhombuses, diamond shapes, set against the lighter color of the blade's body. The pattern is impossibly regular, flowing over the curves of the sword with mathematical perfection. It is not engraved or inscribed on the surface. You can feel that it is an integral part of the metal itself, a two-toned skin that was born in the fire. This is the rhombic enigma, one of the sword's most beautiful and mysterious features. It is a testament to a level of craftsmanship that borders on the supernatural. This pattern was no accident. It was a deliberate and incredibly difficult artistic flourish. The question that has consumed researchers and experimental archaeologists for decades is, how in the world did they do it? There is no surviving manual, no text that spells out the technique. The answer must be reverse engineered from the artifact itself, and there are two leading theories. The first and simpler theory is a form of chemical etching. In this scenario, you, the ancient craftsman, would have first polished the entire blade to a mirror shine. Then, using a fine brush, you would have painstakingly painted a resist, a protective substance like beeswax or tree lacquer, onto the blade. You would not be painting the diamonds themselves, but the thin grid of lines between them. Once this resist had hardened, you would expose the sword to a corrosive agent. This might be an acid, or more likely a sulfur-rich paste or vapor, perhaps from heating sulfur-bearing minerals. The chemical would attack the exposed bronze of the diamonds, reacting with the copper to form a thin, stable, and dark layer of copper sulfide, permanently changing its color. After the reaction was complete, you would clean off the waxy resist, revealing the pristine, light-colored grid lines against the newly darkened rhombuses. The second, more complex, and currently more favored theory, suggests the pattern was created through a sophisticated process of chemical plating and heat treatment. This method, sometimes called sulfuration, proposes that you would apply a special chemical paste, perhaps one rich in tin and sulfur, directly onto the polished blade in the shape of the rhombuses. You would then gently heat the entire sword, not to the high temperatures of quenching, but enough to trigger a chemical reaction. The paste would react with the surface of the bronze, creating the dark, stable sulfide or oxide layer that forms the pattern. This technique would produce a pattern that is more deeply and chemically bonded to the surface. Whichever method was used, the level of skill is astonishing. The pattern is a masterpiece of precision. The lines are straight, the shapes are uniform, and the application is flawless. This is the work of a master artisan with the steady hand of a surgeon and the esoteric knowledge of an alchemist. It is also a fascinating parallel to another legendary patterned blade, Damascus steel. While the famous watery patterns of a Damascus sword were created by a completely different process, the forging and folding of a special type of high-carbon crucible steel, the underlying impulse is the same. In both cultures, The greatest blades were not just functional, they were visibly, breathtakingly magical. A pattern was a sign of a superior technology and a supernatural quality. It is almost certain that the exact method for creating this rhombic pattern was a jealously guarded state secret of the Yue Royale workshop. This kind of knowledge was a form of power, a guarantee that your kingdom's weapons were not only superior, but also inimitable. A mastersmith with this knowledge would have been one of the most valuable assets of the state, and he would have passed the secret down only to a trusted apprentice, likely bound by solemn oaths. It is entirely possible the secret was never written down and simply died with the last generation of smiths who knew it. Because of this, experimental archaeologists and materials scientists are still conducting experiments to replicate the rhombic pattern, with no single method yet universally accepted. Various research teams have managed to create patterns that are similar, using different chemical recipes and application techniques, but none have yet managed to reproduce the flawless perfection of the original. The precise ancient recipe remains an elusive ghost, a testament to a lost art. As you give the sword its final polish, the light catches the pattern, and it seems to shift and shimmer. The blade is now not just a hardened weapon, it is a thing of profound and dangerous beauty. The rhombic enigma transforms it from a tool of war into a work of art, a perfect fusion of brutal function and sublime aesthetics. The sword is nearly complete. It has been born in fire, hardened in water, and now, graced with an impossible beauty. All that remains is to give it its final, lethal whisper, a razor's edge. The sword now lies before you, polished and gleaming, its dark rhombic pattern a testament to the artisan's skill. We have followed its journey through the fire and the water, and seen how its hardness and beauty were bestowed upon it. But now, it's time to step back and admire the master plan. We need to revisit the very blueprint of the blade, the foundational concept that makes all these other processes work in concert. Let's take a deeper look at the brilliant and revolutionary engineering solution at its core, the bimetallic construction. Every swordmaker in history, from the first Bronze Age smith to the modern master, has wrestled with a single fundamental dilemma. It is the eternal trade-off between hardness and toughness. If you make a blade incredibly hard, it can be sharpened to a razor's edge and will hold that edge through use. But extreme hardness comes at the price of brittleness. A hard blade is like glass. Under enough stress, it will chip or even shatter. On the other hand, if you make a blade tough and flexible, it will bend and absorb impacts without breaking. But toughness comes at the price of softness. A tough blade is difficult to sharpen and will dull quickly. For millennia, sword design was a story of compromise, of finding a single material that was a decent but imperfect balance of these two opposing virtues. The smiths of Yue, however, refused to compromise. Their solution was so elegant and so far ahead of its time that it stands as one of the great achievements of ancient engineering. They looked at the dilemma and decided not to choose. Instead of finding one metal that did two jobs passably, they used two different metals, each perfectly suited to a single job, and fused them into one blade. You've seen how this was done. The softer, low-tin bronze for the flexible spine and the harder, high-tin bronze for the lethal edges. This wasn't just a clever recipe, it was a paradigm shift in weapon design. Think about how this design works in synergy with the creation processes we've discussed. The complex piece mold casting was not just a fancy way to make a sword shape, it was the only way to seamlessly fuse the precast hard edges with the molten core. The quenching process then acted as a supercharger for this design. The rapid cooling had a much more dramatic hardening effect on the high tin edges than it did on the low tin spine. The fire and water didn't just harden the sword, they differentially hardened it, pushing the built-in properties of the two alloys to their absolute peak. The design, the casting, and the heat treatment were not separate steps. They were three parts of a single unified system. Now transport yourself to a chaotic, muddy battlefield in 5th century BCE China. Imagine what this weapon would feel like in combat. A northern warrior, perhaps armed with a standard single alloy bronze sword, charges you. He swings. You parry, bringing your blade up to meet his. When the two swords clash, the advantage is decisively yours. His sword, if made of a single hard alloy, might chip or even snap against yours. If his sword is made of a softer, tougher bronze, your impossibly hard edge will bite deep, shearing a chunk out of his blade, perhaps even cutting right through it. Your flexible spine absorbs the shock of the impact, the vibration running up your arm but your blade remaining intact. In an era of endemic warfare, possessing a weapon like this would feel like magic. It would give a warrior a tangible, terrifying, and often decisive advantage. This concept of creating a composite blade to solve the hardness versus toughness problem has appeared in other cultures, though typically much later and in the medium of steel. The master smiths of Japan, centuries later, would perfect a method of laminating their katanas, forge welding a jacket of hard, high-carbon-edge steel, heigane, around a core of softer, shock-absorbing iron, shigane. The Vikings and other European cultures developed pattern welding, twisting and forge welding rods of different types of iron and steel to create blades that were both strong and flexible. The Sword of Goujian can be seen as the cast bronze ancestor to these legendary steel technologies, an independent and much earlier solution to the very same problem. Historians and archaeometallurgists debate whether this sophisticated bimetallic casting technology was an indigenous invention of the southern Wu and Yue states, or if it was an innovation imported from elsewhere and perfected by them. For a long time, the prevailing assumption was that these barbarian southerners must have borrowed their best ideas from the more civilized northern states. But the evidence now strongly suggests that this was a homegrown innovation, a unique product of the southern bronze working tradition, developed to meet the specific demands of their style of warfare. There's even a subtle aesthetic component to this. A composite blade like this would have had a unique voice. We know the ancient Chinese were masters of acoustics, casting enormous sets of perfectly tuned bronze bells. The sound a sword made was considered a measure of its quality. A single alloy sword might have a simple tone, but a bimetallic sword, with its different densities and resonant frequencies, would ring with a clearer, more complex harmonic note when struck. To its wielder, this beautiful sound would be another confirmation of the weapon's inner spirit and superior nature. This brilliant design is the unifying theory of the Sword of Goujian. It is the principle that dictates the recipe, necessitates the complex casting, and is perfected by the heat treatment. It is the very soul of the blade's engineering, the secret that makes it not just a relic but a triumph of ancient technological thought. The sword is now, for all intents and purposes, a finished object, a product of brilliant engineering, complex chemistry, and meticulous artistry. It is a triumph of human ingenuity. But to the people of the spring and autumn period, a weapon of this caliber, a blade that seemed to defy the very laws of nature, could not be the product of science alone. An object this perfect must have a spark of the divine. It must be born not just from a furnace, but from a crucible of magic, sacrifice, and immense human will. To understand the soul of this sword, you have to understand the legends of the people who were believed to make them, the master smiths. In the folklore of the Wu-Yue region, one story towers above all others. It is the legend of Ganjiang and Moye, a husband and wife team of swordsmiths who were considered the greatest to have ever lived. Their story is set in the very time we have been exploring, making them contemporaries of Goujian's great rival, King Helu of Wu. Their tale is the archetypal myth of the master craftsman, a story that reveals the immense cultural and spiritual significance attached to the art of sword-making. The story begins, as these stories often do, with a royal commission. The king of Wu, a powerful and impatient ruler, summons Ganjiang to his court. He commands the smith to forge for him a pair of swords unlike any the world has ever seen. Ganjiang, being the master of his craft, accepts the challenge. He scours the kingdom for the finest materials, gathering the purest iron from the 5 great mountains and collecting the very essence of the sun and moon. He builds his forge and prepares for his masterwork. But when he tries to smelt the metals, they refuse to fuse. The fire sputters, the crucible remains cold, and the ore stubbornly remains a useless, slag-filled lump. For 3 months, Ganjiang toils in vain. He is the greatest smith in the world, yet he has failed. He knows the king's patience is wearing thin, and failure will mean his death. His wife, Moye, sees his despair and understands the true nature of the problem. She comes to him and says, As the legend goes, a work of divine transformation cannot be achieved without a human sacrifice. Why is it that the metal will not flow? She reminds him that his own master could only cast his works by sacrificing himself to the furnace, infusing the metal with his own life force, his qi. In an act of supreme devotion to her husband and his craft, Mo Ye makes the ultimate sacrifice. In some versions of the legend, she clips her hair and fingernails, repositories of her qi, and casts them into the flames. But in the most famous and grisly telling, she throws her entire body into the furnace, her life force becoming the final, magical catalyst that the metal craved. Instantly, the fire roars to life and the molten metal flows like water. A heartbroken but determined Goujian is now able to cast the swords. From the sanctified metal, he forges a matched pair, a male sword, which he names Goujian, and a female sword, which he names Mo Ye. Now Goujian is a brilliant craftsman, but he is no fool. He knows the cruel and paranoid nature of the king. A ruler who possesses such a unique weapon will often kill its creator to ensure the secret is never shared. The precarious relationship between a powerful tyrant and the skilled artisan who serves him is a timeless theme in Chinese history. So Goujian devises a plan. He takes the male sword Goujian, which he deems the superior of the two, and hides it. He then goes to the court and presents only the female sword, Mo Ye, to the king. The king is delighted with the weapon, but he is also deeply suspicious. A court diviner, or perhaps the sword itself, tells him that it is one of a pair. Enraged by the deception, he has Goujian executed. But before he died, Goujian had left a message for Mo Ye and their unborn son, describing a cryptic clue to the location of the hidden sword. Look for a pine tree growing on a stone. The legend then follows their son Qi, who grows into a young man consumed by the need for revenge. He eventually finds the sword hidden inside a stone pillar of their home, and the tale culminates in a wild, supernatural quest for vengeance involving a friendly assassin and a talking, disembodied head. Folklorists and historians still debate whether the legend of Goujian and Mo Ye has any basis in historical reality. Was there a real, exceptionally skilled smith whose life story was embellished into this epic myth? Or is the tale a pure allegory, a grim parable about the nature of tyranny, sacrifice, and the quasi-divine status of the master craftsman? While the Sword of Goujian is bronze, and the legend speaks of iron, the core belief is the same. A weapon of this quality was seen as a living entity, requiring a piece of its maker's soul to be born. The gendering of the swords as male, yang, and female, yin, also fits perfectly within the Taoist worldview of complementary opposites that was developing at the time. The tale of Goujian and Mo Ye, with its themes of sacrifice and hidden power, provides the mythic context for an object like the Sword of Goujian. It helps you understand that for the people of Yue, this blade wasn't just an alloy of copper and tin. It was a vessel of power, born from a sacred process, and potentially infused with the very spirit of its creator. The science is astonishing, but the mythology is what gave the sword its thunder. The sword is finally complete. It has been cast from two metals, quenched in water and polished to reveal a secret, shimmering pattern. Its creation was a fusion of high science and what, to the people of the time, must have felt like pure magic. But the sword's journey is not over when it leaves the master smith's workshop. In fact, it has only just begun. It now enters the complex world of human society, of court politics, and of ritual. And in this world, the sword will acquire a new and powerful identity, one that transcends its physical form. It will become a symbol. In the China of the Zhou dynasty, a sword was far more than just a weapon. For starters, you couldn't just decide to carry one. The right to wear a sword in public was a privilege strictly reserved for the aristocracy, the ruling class of nobles, court officials, and warriors known as the shi. For a gentleman of this class, his sword was an essential part of his daily attire, as fundamental as his ceremonial robes and cap. To appear at court or in any formal setting without his sword at his side would be a shocking breach of protocol, the ancient equivalent of showing up to a black tie gala in shorts and a t-shirt. It was a badge of his rank, a constant visible declaration of his place in the rigid social hierarchy. The specific type of sword, the double-edged, straight jian, carried its own layer of meaning. It was known as the Gentleman of Weapons, a title that embodied the virtues it was supposed to represent: balance, precision, and grace. It stood in stark contrast to the Dao, the single-edged saber that was considered a more brutish, straightforward weapon fit for common soldiers. The Jian demanded finesse and years of training. Its use in combat was a kind of deadly art form. Therefore, to carry a Jian, especially one of exquisite quality, was to make a statement about your own character. It implied you were a man of refinement, discipline, and moral cultivation. A blade like the Sword of Goujian was also an unambiguous symbol of immense wealth and power. This was not a mass-produced item. The bronze alloys required specific, sometimes rare metals. The master smiths capable of performing the complex casting and finishing were the most highly skilled and likely most expensive artisans in the kingdom. The turquoise and other materials used for the hilt were precious. Commissioning a sword of this quality was an act of conspicuous consumption on a royal scale. The 5th century BCE equivalent of commissioning a one-of-a-kind Bugatti. Its flawless craftsmanship broadcast a simple message to all who saw it. Its owner was a person of supreme importance, with the resources of a kingdom at his disposal. Beyond personal status, the sword was a direct instrument of political authority. High-ranking officials and generals were often granted a special sword by the king as a symbol of their delegated power. This sort of authority gave them the right to make life or death decisions in the king's name, including carrying out on-the-spot executions of insubordinate soldiers or corrupt officials. The sword, in this context, became the literal manifestation of the law. For a king like Goujian, his personal sword was the ultimate symbol of this principle. It was the source from which all other authority flowed. This authority was believed to have a cosmic dimension. The king was the son of heaven, the crucial link between the celestial realm and the human world. His personal effects, especially his weapons, were imbued with this sacred connection. The sword was a ritual object, a talisman that could help maintain the balance of the cosmos. Its fine materials and symbolic decorations were intended to align it with the positive forces of the universe, making it a tool not just for winning battles, but for ensuring good harvests and warding off evil spirits. Of course, something this valuable and prestigious made for an excellent diplomatic gift. A king might present a masterwork sword to an ally to seal a treaty, or to a rival as a sign of respect, or a veiled threat. The fact that Goujian's sword was found in the tomb of a nobleman from the rival state of Chu is tantalizing. Was it a war trophy? Or was it a diplomatic gift from a time when Yue and Chu were briefly allied against their common enemy, Wu? The sword is a silent witness to a lost chapter of political intrigue. Military historians and archaeologists still debate how frequently swords of this supreme, almost artistic quality were actually used in the brutal melee of the battlefield. Was Goujian's sword a frontline weapon? Its technical superiority meant to give the king himself an edge in the chaos of combat? Or was it more like a modern general's decorated sidearm, a symbol of rank carried in most situations, but perhaps swapped for a sturdier, less priceless weapon when things got truly messy? The blade's perfection argues for the latter, but its lethal sharpness insists on the former. When King Goujian held this sword, he held a universe of meaning in his hand. It was the physical embodiment of his noble birth, his immense wealth, his absolute political power, and his sacred role as the Son of Heaven. It was a weapon, yes, but that was perhaps its most mundane function. It was, above all, the metallic incarnation of his right to rule. Understanding this profound cultural weight is key to appreciating why it, and other blades like it, were treasured not just as tools, but as legends. So the sword is not just a sharp piece of metal. It's a dense, multi-layered vessel of meaning, a symbol of status, authority, and cosmic power, all wrapped in a mythic aura of magical creation. But how does it stack up on the world stage? Every culture has its own legendary blades, its own stories of supernatural swords wielded by heroes and kings. To truly appreciate what makes the Sword of Goujian so special, you have to place it in that global hall of fame to see how this very real artifact stands shoulder to shoulder with the great swords of history and myth. Your first stop is the misty Isle of Britain, and the most famous mythical sword of them all, Excalibur, pulled from a stone or received from the mystical Lady of the Lake. Excalibur was King Arthur's divine right to rule made manifest. It was a sword of pure magic. Its blade could cut through iron as if it were wood, and more importantly, its scabbard possessed the power to protect its wearer from harm, preventing them from bleeding from any wound. Excalibur is a beautiful and powerful legend, but it is just that, a legend. It lives only in the pages of stories. The Sword of Goujian, by contrast, is a physical object. Its magical properties, its incorruptibility, its enduring sharpness, are not the product of an enchantment but of a lost science. It is a legend you can visit in a museum, a myth proven true by metallurgy. Next, you travel to the heart of a brutally practical empire, Rome. The signature weapon here is the gladius. Short, broad, and wickedly efficient, the gladius was an iron stabbing sword, mass-produced for the legions. It was not a weapon of gentlemen or kings, but a tool for the common soldier, designed for the tight, bloody press of shield wall combat. The gladius was an instrument of empire, a symbol of Rome's military might through uniformity and discipline. It was functional, not beautiful. Goujian's sword is its polar opposite. It is a bespoke masterpiece, a unique work of art created for a single, elite individual. While archaeologists have unearthed thousands of rusted, pitted gladi from the soil of Europe and the Near East, not one possesses the pristine preservation, the artistic grace, or the advanced composite technology of the blade from the Chu tomb. From Rome, you journey east to Japan, and to a sword that offers a much closer parallel, the Kusanagi no Tsurugi, the grass-cutting sword. This sacred blade is one of the 3 imperial regalia of Japan, the symbols of the emperor's divine lineage. According to the myths, the storm god Susanoo discovered the sword inside the tail of a monstrous 8-headed serpent he had slain. Like Goujian's sword, the Kusanagi is a symbol of a ruler's heaven-sent authority. But here is the crucial difference. The Kusanagi is an object of faith. It is reputedly stored at a shrine, is never displayed to the public, and has never been subjected to any form of historical or scientific analysis. Its very existence, let alone its composition or condition, is unverified. The Sword of Goujian, however, has been photographed, X-rayed, and had its chemical composition published in academic journals. It is a national treasure whose legend is confirmed by science. Perhaps the most interesting technological comparison comes from the cold lands of the north, with the great swords of the Vikings. Masterpieces of the early medieval period, like the famed Ulfbert blades, were made of high-quality crucible steel. Many were constructed using a technique called pattern welding, where the smith would take rods of different types of iron and steel, twist them together like candy canes, and then forge weld them into a single laminated billet. This process created blades that were both strong and flexible, and left beautiful watery or herringbone patterns on the surface. Here we see another culture independently arriving at a composite blade solution to the hardness versus toughness problem. But the Vikings were forging steel 1,000 years after the smiths of Yue were casting bronze. That the Yue craftsmen developed a solution so elegant and effective, using a completely different material and a much more ancient technology, is a staggering achievement. Historians of technology still debate the degree to which advanced metallurgical ideas, like composite blade construction, developed independently in different cultures versus spreading through ancient trade and conflict. Is it possible that the fundamental concept of a multi-part blade was a closely guarded secret that slowly trickled across the Eurasian steppe over a millennium? Or did the Viking smiths and the Yue masters arrive at their similar solutions in complete isolation, a remarkable case of convergent technological evolution? The lack of evidence makes it a fascinating and probably unanswerable question. In this grand company, the uniqueness of the Sword of Goujian becomes crystal clear. It does not draw its power from a supernatural myth like Excalibur. It is not a mass-produced tool of war like the gladius. Its history and owner are scientifically verified, unlike the mysterious Kusanagi. And its advanced composite technology predates its closest European parallels by over a millennium. But its final trump card is its condition. Of all the great swords of the ancient world that have been pulled from the earth, none, not one, can match its state of perfect gleaming preservation. It is the one blade that truly collapses the distance between the historical and the mythical. After journeying through history and myth and placing the Sword of Goujian among the legendary blades of the world, you're left with one inescapable conclusion. Its most unique, most miraculous quality is its very existence. Its state of perfect preservation is what elevates it from a mere historical artifact into a scientific enigma. And for every enigma, there is a sprawling, passionate, and often contradictory debate among the experts trying to solve it. For the past 50 years, the sword has been the subject of just such a scholarly battle. You're now taking a seat at the round table, listening to the arguments in the great debate over how the sword truly survived. The entire complex discussion can essentially be boiled down to two opposing camps, two schools of thought that have been vying for supremacy since the 1970s. Let's call them Team Human Genius and Team Happy Accident. On one side of the table, you have Team Human Genius. Their core belief is that the sword's preservation was no accident. It was the result of a deliberate, sophisticated, and now lost technology. They argue that the ancient smiths of Yue were not just craftsmen. They were brilliant materials scientists who designed the sword to be rust-proof. Their Exhibit A is, of course, the chromium. They contend that the discovery of chromium on the blade's surface and on the later terracotta army weapons is too much of a coincidence to be dismissed as environmental contamination. They propose that the Yue artisans had discovered a chemical treatment, perhaps using chromium-rich minerals, that imparted this protective quality, even if they didn't have the language of modern chemistry to describe it. To support their case, they point to the incredible precision seen in every other aspect of the sword's creation. They bring up the ancient Gongji text, with its codified recipes for bronze, as proof of a systematic, almost scientific approach to metallurgy. They point to the flawless rhombic pattern, a feat that required a deep understanding of chemical reactions on metal surfaces. Their argument is one of logical extension. If these smiths were already master chemists when it came to decoration and alloying, isn't it plausible, even likely, that they also applied that genius to the problem of preservation? On the other side of the table sits Team Happy Accident. They listen patiently, and then they offer a simpler, more elegant, and, they argue, more scientific explanation. Their core belief is that the sword's preservation is the result of a perfect storm of lucky, but ultimately unintentional circumstances. Their Exhibit A is the tomb and the scabbard. They argue that the completely sealed, oxygen-free environment, first within the lacquer scabbard and second within the waterlogged tomb, is a perfectly sufficient explanation for the lack of corrosion. It's the principle of Occam's razor. Why invent a complex, lost technology when a known and verifiable set of perfect environmental conditions already explains the result? They directly challenge the chromium theory, presenting the latest research from powerful electron microscopes. This research shows the chromium layer is not a uniform coating, as you'd expect from a deliberate plating process, but is patchy and inconsistent, concentrated in the recesses of the patterns. This, they argue, is the signature of a slow deposition from the surrounding environment, either from chromium salts in the groundwater or from a chromium compound used in the scabbard's lacquer. And then, they ask the most difficult question for Team Human Genius. If this miraculous rust-proofing technology existed, why is it so rare? Why are most other bronze artifacts, even those belonging to kings, found in a state of advanced decay? A truly revolutionary technology, they argue, would have been more widely applied. For decades, these two camps have traded papers and presentations, each side with its valid points. But today, the modern consensus has settled into a more nuanced middle ground, a synthesis that acknowledges the merits of both sides. The emerging view is that there was no single magic bullet. The sword's preservation was the result of a cascade of contributing factors, a story of both genius and luck. It goes like this. First, the element of genius. The Yue smiths intentionally forged a blade from a superior material, the bi-metallic composite whose high tin edges were inherently more resistant to corrosion than standard bronze. This was a deliberate act of brilliant engineering. Second, the element of luck. This superior object was then placed into a miraculously perfect protective environment, the airtight scabbard and the anoxic tomb, which the builders likely had no idea would be so effective. And third, a possible element of bonus luck. The accidental presence of chromium, either from the soil or the lacquer, may have provided an additional, unplanned microscopic layer of protection. The fundamental question at the heart of the debate remains one of intent versus coincidence. To test these competing theories, scientists have turned to the fascinating field of experimental archaeology. Researchers in labs today are casting their own replica bronze swords. They are trying different alloy recipes, different quenching mediums, and various proposed surface treatments. They then subject these modern replicas to artificially aged conditions, trying to see which ancient recipe produces a result that most closely matches the original masterpiece. It is through this process of trial, error, and replication that we get closer to the truth. The sword's greatest legacy may be that after 2,500 years, it is still teaching us, still pushing the boundaries of our knowledge, and still generating a fantastic argument. The scholarly debate rages on, a fascinating 50-year-long conversation held in laboratories and conference halls. But a theory is just a theory until you test it. The ultimate way to understand how the Sword of Goujian was made is to try and make one yourself. This is the world of experimental archaeology, where you leave the safety of the textbook and step into the fire of the forge. You're now joining a modern team on a humbling and often frustrating quest to recreate an ancient marvel. Your team is a kind of supergroup of specialists. There's a master craftsman, an expert in bronze casting, who has a feel for the metal that can't be taught. There's a material scientist armed with spectrometers and electron microscopes, who can provide the precise chemical data. There's a historian who understands the cultural context, and a lacquer artist who knows the secrets of that toxic, magical sap. Their goal is not just to make a sword that looks like Goujian's, but to make it using the same materials and methods, to walk a mile in the ancient smith's shoes. The first challenge is simply getting the ingredients right. Thanks to modern analysis, the team knows the exact recipe, roughly 80% copper, 18% tin, with a little lead and other trace elements. But it's not that simple. Modern metals are often too pure. The copper and tin available to a smith in ancient Yue would have come from ore that contained a host of other impurities. These trace elements, while small in percentage, could have had a significant impact on the alloy's behavior, its melting point, its fluidity, its final hardness. So the first step is a strange one, trying to make a dirtier, more authentic bronze. Once they have their alloys, they face the first great mountain, the bimetallic casting. The team creates their piece molds from clay, just as we've discussed. They cast their high tin edges. They set them in the mold. They heat the low tin bronze for the spine to a searing 1,000 degrees Celsius and prepare for the pour. The first attempt is a disaster. The thermal shock is too great and the precast edges crack the moment the molten bronze touches them. The second attempt is also a failure. The alloys don't fuse properly, and the finished cast has a weak seam right down the length of the blade. It takes months, maybe even years, of trial and error, adjusting the preheating temperature of the molds, the exact timing of the pour, the cooling rate, before they finally pull a single, successfully fused blade from the mold. The experience leaves the team with a profound and humbling respect for their ancient predecessor, who got this right without any of their modern diagnostic tools. Next comes the trial by fire and water, the quench. With their one good casting, the stakes are incredibly high. The craftsman heats the blade, his eyes, like the smiths of old, fixed on the color of the glowing metal. He has a pyrometer to give him an exact temperature, a luxury the ancient smith never knew. But he still relies on instinct. He pulls the blade from the forge and plunges it into the water. There's the terrifying hiss and scream of the metal. He pulls it out. It has survived. It hasn't cracked. It rings with a clear, true tone. The team breathes a collective sigh of relief. Now for the final boss, the rhombic pattern. This is the detail that has stumped replicators for decades. The team tries all the theories. They paint one replica with a wax resist and expose it to sulfur fumes. They paint another with a tin-rich paste and heat it. The results are close, but not quite right. The lines aren't as sharp. The color isn't as deep. This remains the most elusive secret of the sword. In fact, a dedicated team of Chinese scientists and craftsmen spent years working on this problem before they unveiled a high-quality replica in 1994. Their success was a landmark achievement in experimental archaeology. But even their exact process is a closely guarded and debated secret, a testament to the pattern's incredible difficulty. This entire humbling journey fuels a scholarly debate of its own. The sheer complexity of the process makes you question the nature of the ancient workshop. Was the original sword the work of one solitary super genius, a single master who had perfected all of these disparate skills? Or was it the product of a highly organized, specialized workshop, a Bronze Age equivalent of a high-tech factory? You might have had one master for alloying, another for casting, a specialist in quenching, and a secretive artist who handled the decorative patterns. The immense difficulty of the replication process strongly suggests the latter is more likely. Today, this quest is not just confined to university labs. You can find passionate bladesmiths and history enthusiasts on platforms like YouTube, building their own forges and documenting their own attempts to recreate this ancient marvel. It's a beautiful, modern expression of our fascination with the sword, a global community of makers all chasing the same ghost. Ultimately, the quest to replicate the sword teaches one profound lesson: humility. Even with all our scientific knowledge and advanced equipment, we struggle to match the work of a craftsman from 2,500 years ago. The best replicas are stunning achievements, but they are, above all, a tribute. They are a modern world's admission that the smiths of Yue were not primitive artisans. They were masters of a deep and powerful science, a science whose finest secrets may be lost to us forever. The best modern replica of the Sword of Goujian is a masterpiece of science and craftsmanship in its own right. But its greatest achievement is the profound sense of humility it inspires. The struggle to recreate the sword only deepens the mystery and the mastery of the original. So let's leave the modern workshop with its successes and noble failures and return to that one-of-a-kind, inimitable original. We're going to follow its modern journey, from the moment it was lifted from its muddy tomb to its current place of honor, resting as one of the world's great cultural treasures. In December of 1965, after the initial shock and awe of its discovery had subsided, the sword began its new life. It was carefully catalogued, photographed, and then packed with the utmost care for transport. You can imagine the tense journey under armed guard, leaving the rural dig site at Jiangling County and traveling to the provincial capital of Wuhan. There it was taken deep into the conservation labs of the Hubei Provincial Archaeological Institute. This was its first modern home, a place of sterile tables and scientific instruments. Here, it was gently cleaned of the tomb's grime, its properties were meticulously studied, and the long process of deciphering its inscription began. For the first few years, it was a scientific specimen, a source of quiet excitement within the academic community. But once the inscription was confirmed to bear the name of the legendary King Goujian, the sword was catapulted from obscurity to national fame. In the context of 1970s China, an artifact like this was more than just an old object. It was a powerful symbol of the nation's deep, continuous history and a testament to the ingenuity of the Chinese people. It became an instant source of immense national pride, a piece of tangible proof of the glories of the past. The sword wasn't just an archaeological find anymore, it was a national icon. Its new status as a cultural ambassador meant it was destined to travel. While its permanent home would always be Hubei, the sword was occasionally loaned out for major international exhibitions. It was a centerpiece in the groundbreaking exhibition of archaeological finds of the People's Republic of China, which toured the world in the 1970s, offering many in the West their first glimpse of the treasures being unearthed in China. You can almost picture the sword getting its own diplomatic passport, traveling with a level of security usually reserved for heads of state. But this life of international travel came to an abrupt and unfortunate end in 1994. The sword was on loan for an exhibition in Singapore. In a moment that must have sent a collective shiver of horror through the entire museum world, a worker accidentally knocked the display case. The sword, resting on its stand, shifted, and its blade struck the hard inner wall of the case. The damage was small, a 7mm long crack, but it was horrifying. A flawless 2,500-year-old object had been damaged for the first time in its long existence by a moment of modern carelessness. The incident caused a diplomatic uproar and immense distress in China. A decision was made. The sword would never again be allowed to leave the country. Its traveling days were over. Today, the Sword of Goujian rests in its permanent and final home, the Hubei Provincial Museum in Wuhan. It's a vast, modern institution, one of China's finest, holding over 200,000 priceless artifacts. You walk through its halls past cases of ancient pottery and jade. The museum is most famous for two world-class collections: the unbelievable treasures from the 5th century BCE tomb of Marquis Yi of Zheng, including a colossal 65-piece set of perfectly tuned bronze bells, and the artifacts from the Chu tombs with the Sword of Goujian as the undisputed star attraction. You finally reach its gallery. The room is often crowded, the atmosphere hushed and reverent, and there it is. It lies alone in a custom-built, climate-controlled glass case. The lighting is low and dramatic, carefully angled to catch the golden sheen of the bronze and make the dark rhombic pattern shimmer. You see people from all over the world, their faces close to the glass, their phones held up to capture a slightly blurry photo of the legend. It's an object that possesses a powerful charisma. We've all felt that sense of museum fatigue, where your eyes glaze over after seeing the 100th pot from some long-dead dynasty. The Sword of Goujian shatters that fatigue. It's a showstopper, an artifact that commands your full and undivided attention. This very act of display, however, is the subject of a constant, quiet debate within the museum world. Curators and conservators constantly engage in a debate over the balance between exhibition and preservation. Every photon of light that strikes an ancient object causes a tiny, irreversible amount of photochemical damage. Is the immense educational and cultural value of having the sword on public display worth the microscopic cumulative harm that the light and environmental fluctuations will inevitably cause over the next century? It's a difficult ethical tightrope to walk, balancing the needs of the object with the desires of the public who longs to see it. For now, the sword rests in its glass sanctuary. Its journey is complete. It has gone from a king's hand to a watery grave, to the laboratory bench, and finally, to this pedestal. It no longer serves the ambitions of a single ruler, but the curiosity and wonder of millions. It is a silent ambassador from a distant past, its story still unfolding with every new scientific study and every visitor who stands before it in awe. There it rests, the Sword of Goujian, silent and still behind its climate-controlled glass. It has become a destination, an object of pilgrimage for lovers of history, science, and art. But the sword's story doesn't end at the museum walls. In the 21st century, an object's influence isn't confined to its physical location. The sword has escaped. Its essence, the story of its discovery, its impossible sharpness, its royal owner, its mysterious survival, has broken free and is now echoing through the vast, interconnected world of modern storytelling. The sword has become the real-world archetype for one of the most beloved tropes in fiction, the perfectly preserved ancient blade. Every time a hero in a movie or a character in a fantasy novel pulls a sword from a centuries-old tomb, and it slides from the scabbard with a whisper, quiet shing, gleaming and ready for battle, they are unknowingly channeling the spirit of Goujian. The sword is the factual anchor for 1,000 fictional fantasies. It's the reference point that makes the impossible seem, for a moment, plausible. You can see its clearest reflection in the Chinese film genre of wuxia, or martial hero. These films are steeped in a world of legendary warriors, esoteric martial arts, and, most importantly, named legendary swords. The entire plot of the global phenomenon Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon revolves around a mythical Jian called the Green Destiny, a blade of supreme quality that is both a symbol of honor and a source of great conflict. While the Green Destiny is a fictional creation, it perfectly embodies the cultural and mystical weight that a real sword like Goujian's would have carried. The sword's own story, and the epic tale of its owner's revenge, has also been the subject of countless Chinese historical television dramas, where the gleaming blade serves as the central, powerful symbol of Goujian's enduring will. Perhaps its most widespread influence today can be found in the world of video games. In the language of gaming, The Sword of Goujian is the ultimate legendary drop, an item of immense rarity and power. It has appeared by name as a discoverable relic in strategy games like Sid Meier's Civilization the 6-6, granting the player who finds it a bonus to their military strength. Its design and story have influenced the creation of countless unique weapons and action games set in ancient China, like the popular Dynasty Warriors franchise, or in fantasy role-playing games that draw from a global pool of myths. The sword's real-life stats, its composite nature, its incredible sharpness, make it a perfect template for a top-tier in-game weapon. The more sensational aspects of the sword's story have also given it a vigorous life in the world of popular pseudoscience and alternative history. The now largely discredited theory of ancient chromium plating is a favorite piece of evidence for those who believe in lost, super-advanced civilizations or even ancient alien visitations. The sword is often presented in TV shows and books about such topics as unexplained artifact number 1, proof that the ancient world possessed a level of chemical knowledge that mainstream history supposedly conspires to ignore. It is a powerful example of how a compelling mystery can take on a life of its own, creating its own set of popular facts that are far more resistant to decay than the sword itself. This, of course, creates a fascinating conversation for media scholars. Cultural critics and historians debate the impact of pop culture history on the public's understanding of the actual artifact. Does putting the sword in a video game as a +10 magical weapon help or hinder real historical literacy? On one hand, it can trivialize the object, reducing a complex artifact to a set of stats. On the other hand, it can act as a gateway, sparking a genuine interest in a young player, who then goes on to look up the real story, opening a door to a world of history and science they might never have otherwise encountered. Today, you can even find a thriving community of artisans and collectors who keep the sword's legacy alive in a very tangible way. High-end, and often very expensive, replicas are painstakingly created by modern mastersmiths for enthusiasts around the world. For these collectors, owning a faithful reproduction is a way to hold the legend in their own hands, a physical connection to the story. It's a modern, global form of patronage for an ancient art. The Sword of Goujian now lives a double life. There is the physical blade, the silent object that rests securely in the Hubei Provincial Museum. And then there is its ghost, its story, which is free and unbound. This ghostly echo of the sword is endlessly reproducing itself in our films, our games, and our collective imagination. In a way, it has achieved a new and more potent kind of immortality. Its story has become as sharp and enduring as its legendary edge. And so the ghost of the sword now haunts our digital world, its story retold in a language of pixels and polygons. But as we come to the end of our own journey together, it's the other ghost that commands our attention, the ghost of the lost knowledge that created it. Let's go back one last time, past the pop culture echoes, past the museum glass, and back to the object itself. It lies there, a perfect intersection of science and legend, a place where the rational and the magical become impossible to separate. For every scientific explanation we have uncovered, a deeper sense of wonder has emerged. To learn that the sword is not just bronze but a bimetallic composite doesn't debunk the magic. It simply redefines it. The magic is no longer an enchantment but the sheer mind-boggling genius of the engineer. To learn that its preservation is due to an anoxic tomb and an airtight scabbard does not make it mundane. It makes you marvel at the perfect, beautiful coincidence of it all. The science doesn't strip away the sword's legendary aura. It reveals that the legend was real, just written in a language of chemistry and metallurgy that we are only now beginning to relearn. The Sword of Goujian is perhaps the most spectacular example of what we call lost technology. But it is not alone. History is littered with these tantalizing ghosts. Think of the Antikythera mechanism, the 2,000-year-old Greek astronomical clock whose intricate gearwork wouldn't be seen again for another 1,000 years. Or consider the formula for Roman concrete, a material that could set underwater and has produced structures that are still standing, durable and strong, after 2 millennia, while modern concrete often begins to crumble after 50 years. These artifacts are profound and humbling because they challenge our comfortable, linear narrative of progress. The idea that we are always smarter and more capable than the people who came before us. Technology is a surprisingly fragile thing. It gets lost. The primary reason the advanced art of bronze working faded was the rise of iron. Iron ore was far more abundant and cheaper than copper and tin, making it possible to equip entire armies of common soldiers. The iron swords of the subsequent Warring States period were not as technologically refined as the Sword of Goujian, but you could make a lot more of them. The elite, expensive, and difficult art of composite bronze casting became a military and economic dead end. Knowledge that isn't used is eventually forgotten. Skills were often passed down through oral tradition, from master to a single apprentice. If that chain was ever broken, by war, by plague, or simply by a new king who favored a different workshop, the knowledge could vanish in a single generation, leaving behind only the silent, brilliant objects. What we see in the Sword of Goujian is a classic case of survivorship bias. We are rightly astonished by this one perfect specimen that survived against all odds. What we don't see are the thousands of other swords from that era. We don't see the ones that were poorly cast and failed, the ones that broke in battle, the ones that were melted down to make bells or pots, or the vast majority that simply submitted to the laws of chemistry and corroded into unrecognizable lumps. This one spectacular survivor gives us a tantalizing but perhaps skewed glimpse into the absolute peak of their technology, making the lost knowledge seem all the more profound. The study of these ancient technologies always forces us to navigate between two extremes. On one side is the old, slightly patronizing view of primitivism, the idea that ancient people were superstitious and that their greatest achievements were mostly happy accidents. On the other side is a kind of modernism, the sometimes overzealous belief that they were exactly like us, possessed of a systematic written-down science that we have simply lost the manuals for. The truth, as the sword so elegantly demonstrates, is a complex and beautiful middle ground. It is the story of a deep, intuitive, and empirical science, honed over generations of trial and error, combined with a healthy dose of good fortune. The Sword of Goujian is, in the end, a deeply humbling object. It's a quiet but insistent reminder that the story of humanity is not a simple, straight line trending ever upward. It is a twisting path, with moments of brilliant sunshine and long valleys of shadow where beautiful things can be forgotten. The sword is a message in a bottle, a whisper from one of those sunlit peaks, a testament to the timeless power of human ingenuity, and a gleaming, perfect lesson that the past still has secrets to teach us. And so, our long journey through time comes to a gentle close. We have walked through the damp earth of a forgotten tomb, stood in the fiery heat of a master's forge, and wandered the quiet, hallowed halls of a modern museum. We have followed the story of a king, a kingdom, and the single perfect object that has come to embody them both. The sharp, clear lines of its history have blurred into the soft, mythic glow of its legend, and now even that begins to fade as we return from the past. The echoes of the forge are quieting, replaced by the soft hum in your own room. The brilliant gleam of the bronze is dimming, giving way to the gentle darkness behind your own eyes. The story is told, the mystery has been pondered, and what remains is a sense of quiet wonder, a peaceful contemplation of a beautiful thing that waited patiently for thousands of years just to share its tale with you tonight. Now, let the silence settle back in. Let your thoughts drift and soften, and allow yourself to ease into the quiet that follows the end of a long story.